My name is Michael Miller. I'm writing this as a step-by-step recounting of the cold winter night I spent in the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. Some of the things I'm about to tell you may seem illogical or hard to believe. I simply ask that you patiently follow me as I guide you through every second of my adventure. My journey began on February 6th, 2018. I am a police officer here in one of the smallest and most peaceful towns in Oregon. I will omit the exact names of places so that no one attempts to trace my steps. On that late Thursday evening, I finished my shift and made the decision to embark on a long hike over the weekend to find a secluded spot deep in the forest to camp. This week had been particularly stressful. Officers John Smith and Lucas Weber were transferred to another department, so I, along with the other 4 patrol officers, had to pick up their hours here. Overtime is overtime, yes, but lack of sleep and dealing with the quirks of rural America can wear down even the strongest minds. On Friday morning, I woke up around 6:15 a.m. and began brewing coffee with my coffee maker while heading to the bathroom. I grabbed my cup and went down to the basement to retrieve my hiking and camping gear from the dry storage rooms. The first thing I grabbed was my Osprey Ether AG70 hiking backpack. The gear is massive but super lightweight and holds everything I need, except for my A-Alps Mountaineering Tasmanian 3 tent, which attaches to the bottom of the backpack. I secured the tent to the backpack and then reached for my Keen hiking boots as well as the necessary items like my Nemo Disco 30 sleeping bag, a small pot for hot water, a pack of Safety Chem glow sticks, a TACMED Patrol Trauma Response First Aid Kit, 2 Duracell headlamps, spare batteries of course, water purification tablets, an Nalgene 1-liter water bottle, and my rechargeable phone charger. After gathering everything necessary from the basement, I brought it all to the living room and placed it on the corner sofa. I went to the bedroom to grab spare clothes for the next day and an extra beanie hat in case something happened to my main hat. Back in the living room, I began neatly packing everything into my backpack when my phone rang. It was my colleague and good friend Stefan, who warned me about a cold snap that was expected to hit later in the afternoon. I wondered if I should still go, but he just said it was my decision. I thanked him, hung up, and continued packing. I grabbed 6 MRE packs from the kitchen and stuffed them along with a few Snickers bars for a little reward into my backpack. I took 4 Hot Pockets from the freezer, heated them up, and ate them as quickly as possible to save time. By the time I finished packing, it was 7:10 a.m. I took a shower and washed up with a deodorizing soap so that predators couldn't easily detect my scent. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a big hiking nerd. I don't buy cheap stuff when it comes to my gear and essentials. I only buy the best of the best for my safety. After the shower, I packed my toiletries into my backpack and got dressed in the bedroom. In case you're interested, I was wearing black Patagonia Quandary pants, a heather gray The North Face fleece hoodie, a black Marmot Phoenix jacket, and a light gray Patagonia Fisherman's Fold beanie. I know it's a lot of detail, but I want you to really feel everything I felt all the time and prove that I vividly remember the finest details of the worst day of my life. I took all my stuff to the garage and placed everything on the hitch of my VW transporter. I checked everything to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. I opened my gun cabinet and grabbed my SIG P320 service pistol and my OWB duty holster. I always keep a full magazine in my sidearm, so I thought I'd bring a box of 30 rounds in case I wanted some fun. I strapped everything down, loaded my backpack onto the back seat of the transporter, and set off into nowhere. The mood outside and the drive to the trailhead were somewhat unsettling. It's hard to describe the feeling I had while driving in the dark, as if someone in the back seat was intensely staring at me. I am a 6 feet 3 inches, 230-pound man who doesn't scare easily, but I was terrified. It was 7:45 a.m. on a Friday, and I only passed by one other person. Normally, traffic at this time would be moderate, but it seemed like everyone had left town or were still in their houses sleeping. I turned on my car radio and connected my phone to listen to some metal to pump myself up, but for some reason, it only increased my anxiety tenfold. I had just passed the last traffic light of the town and drove into the well-lit underground tunnel. Not 3 seconds after entering the tunnel, I had to brake immediately, thanks to the stupid dog that suddenly jumped onto the road in front of me. I'm not exaggerating, that dog literally came out of nowhere. The tunnel has a two-way street with solid concrete walls on both sides, only about 5 feet from the road, so I would have seen the dog at the roadside if it had been there. It was almost as if the animal had run out of the wall and jumped directly in front of my transporter. It happened so fast, and my adrenaline shot through the roof as I saw the dog, so I didn't feel or hear anything as I hit it. At least, that's what I thought. I pulled over to the roadside to inspect the damage, but to my surprise, there was nothing on the ground behind the transporter and no signs of damage to the front of my vehicle. I looked in both directions of the tunnel and saw no silhouette of anything, just the entrance and exit of the tunnel. I was completely freaked out. Something like this had never happened to me before. I never believed in the paranormal until that moment. I got back into my transporter and drove out of the tunnel. I didn't want this incident to ruin my entire weekend, so I stayed strong and continued towards the trailhead. Don't get me wrong, I was still scared. The rest of the way to the trailhead was uneventful, and I didn't pass by another vehicle at all. I knew something was off about my morning, but I was stubborn and didn't want anything to ruin my weekend. The trailhead was deserted. It was still dark outside, but the faint orange lights were on, and I could see the pitch-black opening between the trees. That was the hiking trail. I parked on the right side of the trail and turned off the transporter. I sat there for at least a minute, staring into the pitch-black opening. The silence was eerie. All I could hear were various ringing tones in my own head. I looked at the temperature gauge, and it showed -5 degrees Celsius. I sighed a little, got out of the transporter, yawned deeply, and stretched up to the sky, then reached for my jacket on the passenger seat. I took the backpack out and placed it on the hitch to grab a headlamp, but as soon as I placed the lamp over my hat, I heard a noise that sounded like a sneeze. I couldn't tell who or what it came from, if it was even a sneeze, but it had that distinct hiss-hush sound. I stopped abruptly and scanned the parking lot, but I couldn't see anything. As a police officer for 13 years, I know when something evil is watching me, and that's exactly how I felt at that moment. I ignored it, turned on my lamp, strapped my backpack back on, and headed down the trail. I turned around once more to look at the parking lot, but saw no one. I dismissed it all as a possible animal in the woods and continued down the path. I hiked for about 20 minutes until the sun finally rose over the Oregon forest. I could see the frost glittering on everything. It was beautiful. The morning birds were singing their routine songs, and I felt safer because there was still life around me. I came to a small bridge crossing a little brook about 3 miles up the trail. I stopped, took a break, and drank some water, then heard that sneeze noise again. This time, it sounded like it was coming a little way back, where I had just come from. My heart began to beat faster and faster. For some reason, I remembered the dog and thought maybe it had followed me all the way, but that was impossible. I drove the entire distance at 50 miles per hour because there was no traffic. I got tired of worrying about it, so I said, "Hey, is someone down there?" But got no answer. I felt strange, but I knew I could handle myself, so I kept walking up the trail. I came to a fork in the path, and one of the ways looked like people used it daily, while the other was overgrown with tall yellow grass, making it hard to see that it was even a path. I knew I wanted to be left alone by others, so I took the grassy path. The trail was so overgrown that I didn't notice the frozen puddles under my feet and learned the hard way. My left leg slipped off the edge of the trail onto the steep slope into the ravine. Instinctively, I grabbed the nearest thing to avoid falling, but the only thing I could grab was the jagged, icy edge of the path, which tore my index finger wide open. I rolled into the ravine and landed flat on my stomach. Physically, I was unable to get up for about 10 seconds. I must have been unconscious, but I could still see the ground where my face was lying. I sat up and immediately looked at my finger, and that's when the pain set in. I took off my backpack and grabbed the trauma kit. I cleaned the wound with alcohol and wrapped it tightly with gauze and medical tape. At this point, I was angry and screamed, "Damn it," at the top of my lungs. After doing that, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and looked up the trail to see nothing. I put the first aid kit back in the backpack, packed it on my back, and marched up the slope to get back on the trail. It wasn't until I was back on the trail that I noticed the tall, dead yellow grass was still covering the path down. There were also no icy patches anymore, just gravel and dirt. I was confused for a moment and thought I had landed next to another path, but there was a trail sign I had seen before my fall, and it was only a few meters away from me. I was confused, but continued my way a bit further. I came to the steep part of the trail and, to my surprise, saw a large open lake. I didn't know there was a lake in this part of the Oregon forest, but there it was. It was crystal clear. I remember the elegant blue shimmer it had, with occasional ice patches on top, but the entire area was dead silent. No wind, no birds, just silence. There was no path on either side of the lake. The path I was on ended right beneath my feet. I scanned the area further, and above the tree line on my right side, saw something that looked like a large cross in the distance. I never expected that in the middle of nowhere, let alone in the woods. I walked towards the tree line, and as I took about 6 steps towards it, I heard the hiss-hush noise directly behind me. I felt my knees give slightly with fear, but I steadied myself and turned around to see something pale at the edge of the lake. I slowly approached it while turning around to see if I could find what was causing the noise, but then a smell hit me. I felt my throat tighten and my stomach grow heavy. Then, as I reached the water, I realized that the pale thing I saw was the head of a woman. I couldn't even move. I didn't make a sound. I just stared. The left side of her head was sticking out of the water and had no flesh or tissue, just a pale white skull. The top of her head had short white hair with dark red tones. I didn't want to touch the head to see what the other side looked like. I simply turned around and gagged from the smell. I wiped my mouth with my hand, then heard a bloody scream from the same direction where I had seen the cross. I began to sprint through the trees toward the cross. I reached the other side of the tree line and saw a large field. On the other side of the field stood a large church with a wooden cross on top. I jogged to the church and began calling out, "Help is on the way. I need to know where you are." Zrania, but I got no response. Halfway through the field, I tripped over something hard. I sat down and saw that I had tripped over a goat's skull. My first thought was that maybe people live up here and have a small farm. I stood up and ran to the church. There was a wooden fence about 3 feet high around the perimeter, and I jumped over it. The wood of the church looked almost ancient and rotted. It had obviously been there for a very long time. I called out again, "Hello," and got nothing. I leaned against the fence to inspect my knee. I had pretty badly injured it when I tripped over the skull, but before I could pull up my pant leg, I heard a faint chanting coming from the church. My heart stopped. I stood there dead still. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it sounded like Latin or maybe Spanish, but all I could hear was Estacinem talk. They repeated this over and over, and it sounded like many people were there. I looked between the beams of the church walls to peek inside, but there was no one. No light, nothing. Just old pews and light shining through the cracks in the walls. The chanting stopped as I looked into the building. Everything became silent again. As I stared into the church, I saw something black out of the corner of my right side. I jerked my head around to see what looked like the lower end of a robe passing by the corner of the building. I ran over to peek around the corner, but saw no one. At the front of the church were carvings. They looked like pentagrams with some sort of skull in the center. I knew immediately that I was in a very bad place. I noticed the same thing out of the corner of my eye and saw whatever it was passing behind the other side of the building. I called out, "Who are you?" "My name is Officer Miller. Come out and talk to me." I approached the corner of the building and heard a swirling noise behind me, followed by an axe flying past my head. I turned around and saw two men in black robes approaching me, both holding improvised knives made of rusty metal. I drew my SIG from the holster and aimed my laser at the man on the left. I shouted, "Drop your weapons or I'll use deadly force." They continued walking toward me, about 150 feet away. The man on the left threw his knife at me and I luckily dodged it by ducking to the right. I stood up and yelled, "Last chance, drop those damn weapons!" They both started running toward me. I fired a bullet into the head of the man on the right. The man on the left stopped and stared at the lifeless man on the ground, then looked toward the church and called out something that sounded like "Ma tra ke lo." Then I heard the chanting I had heard earlier, only this time loud. The man looked at me, and as we locked eyes, men and women in robes came out of the church, loudly chanting. None of them had weapons, but they were all tall, very tall, somewhere between 9 feet and 10 feet. All of them walked slowly, heads bowed. The man turned around and disappeared into the crowd of giants. I began to walk backwards in shock, not knowing what to do. One of the conspicuously large ones in front of the crowd let out a bloody scream that shook my ears. Then I raised my weapon and shot him in the leg. I say him because I couldn't tell if he was male or female due to the massive scars on his face. He fell to his knees and let out a whimper. Then they all paused and stared at me. All of them had their faces somehow mutilated. Some of them didn't even have eyes, but they still stared directly at me. At this point, my adrenaline was so high that I felt my heart beating in my arms and legs. The woman got back on her feet, pointed at me, and quietly repeated, "Ma tra ke lo." And at that very moment I felt and heard a breath on my neck. I turned around to see what looked like a large, stocky man without a jaw staring at me. He was completely naked and had ugly cut wounds all over his body. His tongue hung limply from his mouth as he breathed hoarsely through his saliva. He let out a slight chuckle, followed by the hiss-hush sound I had heard before, then grabbed me by the backpack strap and slammed me to the ground. The people in robes began to cheer as the creature screamed towards the sky and pounded his chest with his right hand. He looked down at me and glared at me. I tried to scream in pain, but I had no breath, and my chest hurt. I unzipped my backpack and slipped it off. The creature lifted his right foot over me and began to scream. I rolled away from him as he tried to stomp his foot on the ground. He let out an angry scream, then the people began to scream furiously. I got up and ran along a brick path away from the church. I could hear the heavy steps of the axeless creature close behind me, and the screams of the people became wilder and almost guttural. I ran between two burning torches along the path, one on each side, and the screaming stopped, and I couldn't hear the creature's steps anymore. I turned around and saw that they were all standing on the other side of the torches. I stood there, panting and trying to catch my breath. An old weathered man at the edge of the crowd stared at me and spoke both in Spanish and German. "Casa de Diablo, you are now one of them." They all slowly turned around and walked silently up the brick path. It got dark outside, even though it should still be morning. I looked around to figure out where I was. To my right stood a small shed. Directly down the brick path, a collapsed barn, and next to the barn, an old cabin. I bent down and placed my hands on my knees to think about how to get out of here. I muttered, "My damn backpack. Everything I need to survive is in this backpack." I realized I had to go back to the church to grab my backpack, but that wouldn't be easy if those beings were still up there. I stood up and turned around to the path to the church to see a black dog between the two torches. I immediately recognized the dog that had run away from my transporter that morning. The dog let out a deep growl as the skin on its face looked very loose, almost as if it was melting. The deep growl turned into a loud half-whine, half-roar, almost like a lion's roar or a big cat's roar. I turned around and began sprinting toward the shed next to the barn. The dog growled briefly behind me. The door to the shed was wide open, so I ran inside and slammed the door shut immediately. I leaned against the door and waited for the dog to try to push it open, but there was no sound from outside. I stood there and took a deep breath as a foul flesh odor filled my nose. My throat tightened again, and I felt unwell. I heard something that sounded like a hungry stomach gurgling somewhere back in the shed, but it was loud. Hesitantly, I looked to the left and saw a creature slowly rising from the ground. There was little to no light in the shed, only light from outside shining through the cracks in the walls. I could make out the shape of a large but thin figure in the main room in front of me. Then it made a leaking sound, like a dog licking peanut butter off its palate. After that, it let out a brutal, guttural scream mixed with the pain of a woman in pure agony and ran toward me. As it revealed itself in the light, I could see that it was indeed large, but it had the head of a black goat and the legs of a horse, which were, however, bent backward and thinner. I moved to draw my weapon, but the creature was too fast. It sprinted toward me, rammed its head directly into my chest, and threw me 6 feet into a wall. My weapon fell out of my hand and slid about 3 feet away from me, so I rolled toward it, but the creature managed to kick my left hand. I screamed in pain and curled into a ball as the creature continued to scream and stomp around me. I looked up and saw it staring at the ceiling, with a protruding tongue and drooling mouth. I jumped to my feet, grabbed the weapon from the ground, and aimed the laser at the creature's neck. My adrenaline was so high that my hands were shaking violently. As I tried to pull the trigger, I shot off its left horn. It tore the head toward me and let out one of the screams, then lowered its head to ram me again. I dodged and landed sideways, with the laser directly aimed at its neck. I pressed the trigger and saw the creature fall flat to the ground. Its breathing was angry, and the sounds it made with every breath sounded like gurgling because of the blood. It lay flat on the ground like a fish out of water as I ran out of the shed. I came outside and looked for an escape route. The giant people walked down the path from the church, chanting loudly, and the dog was nowhere to be seen. I looked back into the shed and saw that the goat creature was still gurgling but trying to stand up. As I looked at the shed, I saw a path leading behind it. I ran that path, and at the end, I could see 2 more torches and a path leading into a cave. The path was long, and a cave was the last place I wanted to go, but it was my only option. As I sprinted down the way, I noticed that along the path were spike posts with heads of young women and various organs hanging from them. I ran into the cave and only went about 10 feet inside before I realized that I had no light and the cave was pitch dark. The giant beings knew I was there and that I was trapped. They rolled a boulder in front of the entrance, leaving me in absolute darkness and all alone. I fell to my knees and then to my butt and began to cry. Not sobbing, but crying, knowing that I would die this way. I began to hear the echo of heavy breathing from deep within the cave. It sounded like whatever it was had completely stopped breathing. The echoes grew louder and louder with each second. Then I began to feel vibrations on the ground from loud thuds hitting the floor almost like horse hooves, but heavier, if that makes sense, and there was more than one set. Almost like warriors marching into battle. The echoes transformed into the same guttural screams the creature in the shed made, but they came from all directions. The sounds eventually reached every side of me, then my feet were being pulled out from underneath me. I felt hooves slamming against every part of my body. I heard my own bones cracking, louder than all other sounds in the cave. I felt the flesh of my stomach being ripped apart by the fingers of these creatures. They opened my chest and plucked my organs out, letting them fall into my face piece by piece. I lay there in total agony as these beings literally tore me apart. I remember thinking, how am I still conscious? My entire body eventually went numb. Shortly after, I heard one of the beings let out an ugly, gurgling scream and stomped on my head. I felt my skull being crushed under the weight of the being. Then I felt nothing anymore. I heard nothing. I felt absolutely nothing anymore. Almost as if I had slept. Suddenly, I could open my eyes. All I could see was a bright, blurry light. Then my vision returned, and I saw that I was lying face down on the ground. I couldn't move, but I knew I was no longer in the cave. I had regained mobility, so I painfully sat up and looked around. I was back in the ravine I had fallen into at the start of my journey. I looked at my hand, and my finger was neither torn nor showed any signs of ever being cut. My body was not torn apart, and my left hand was not stomped by that damn monster. I felt my shoulders to make sure I still had the backpack straps. I felt my head to ensure I wasn't bleeding, but I was completely fine. I only had a headache. I began to cry as I climbed up the slope, believing that I was in an endless loop visiting hell. But as I reached the trail, the tall, dead yellow grass was still covering the way down. I could see the torn grass from where I had fallen and rolled down the slope. I began to cry harder as I returned to the main trail. Joggers and people walking their dogs passed by and gave me strange looks. No one said anything, but they stared at me out of fear or shock. I couldn't look anyone in the eyes. I just stared straight ahead and walked back to my transporter. I placed my backpack on the back seat and headed home. Traffic was back to normal, and people were on their way, living normal lives. I got home and brought my backpack to the basement, simply threw it on the floor, and walked upstairs like a zombie. I sat on the sofa and saw my phone lying on the coffee table. I had accidentally left it there, and the battery was dead. I turned on the TV and switched the channel to the news networks. I almost collapsed. It was Friday, February 14th. Exactly 1 week after I started my camping trip. I had been away for a week, but all I could remember was the night I spent in that God-forsaken village. The next day, I had to talk to a few investigators from the police station and tell them about my disappearance and the experiences. One of them didn't believe a word I said, but the other had a curious face the whole time I spoke, but then tried to rationalize the situation. Then they told me that, to keep my job, I had to see a therapist twice a month and go through their investigations to determine if I was mentally ill or if what I told them was actually true. I had to go through their nonsense for days, but all my psychological evaluations came back clean, and every lie detector test proved I wasn't lying. I'm back at my job and living my life as normally as possible. I can't help but constantly wonder who the people in the cult were. What were the beings I saw? Did I really just dream it all and sleep through a whole week in the freezing cold? I don't know. I'll never find out, and the world will never understand the things I went through. I just ask you to try. Despite what some might tell you, working in this field isn't as terrible as it seems. Sure, some of the older residents can be difficult at times, and like any other job, this one has its unpleasant moments. But most of them are good-hearted people. You just need a bit of compassion and patience to reach them. So, yes, I mostly love this job. I wouldn't give it up if I could. The only part I don't like are the occasional confessions from some patients. They say that people can feel the end coming, and after a few years in this profession, I believe them. Some of them have no one left, no family or friends, so they lay their dirty laundry out for us caregivers. Most of the time, it's pretty harmless stuff. Mr. Johnson cheated on his wife in his 30s. Mark was once involved in hardcore BDMS. Emily stole from her company for a while. Things you don't necessarily expect, but in hindsight, not surprising. Other times, though, it bordered on disturbing behavior. Jake had a bar fight and ran away, and to this day he's not sure if the other man survived. Sarah had an abortion on her own, without telling her then-boyfriend she was even pregnant. Claire left her family, ran away at night to start a new life, and the missing person reports ate away at her. These are the kinds of things that get on my nerves, but I can at least understand where they're coming from. I can empathize, even if I don't condone their actions. But then there are the monsters, those who have committed truly heinous acts, and their confessions keep me awake at night. Julia, the loveliest old lady you could ever meet, manipulated her husband into committing suicide to collect his life insurance. Freddie helped burn down an entire village during the Vietnam War, enjoying the flames and the screams of the dying. Sally abused her child so severely during upbringing that it caused a host of developmental problems. Know this, I wasn't present for all these confessions myself. We caregivers tend to share, as morbid as it may sound. Feel free to judge if you want, but we didn't want these burdens on our shoulders and seek relief wherever we can find it. Most of the time, it's just innocent gossip, the "you won't believe what Gary did back in the day" type. Other times, there are tears and silent screams in the break room, stone-hard expressions, and a suffocating atmosphere, no hint of cheerfulness. But that's life in this line of work. Most of us have learned to live with it, and those who couldn't have quit. I belong to the first group, and I don't think the last weekend will change that. Anyway, that's what I tell myself. You need some context to understand it all. It all started with Mr. Thompson, so I should begin there. He is a bitter old man. No euphemisms. A tough nut, full of anger and hatred towards everyone and everything, always simmering just below the surface. He's the kind of person who's only satisfied when your parade is soaked to the bone by the rain. He's been here since before I was hired, so the other caregivers warned me about him from the start. God bless you if you have to deal with him. He can ruin your whole week just by opening his mouth, they told me. I didn't take them seriously and thought he couldn't be that bad. Spoiler alert, he was, but not in the way you'd expect. He didn't become physically violent like some of the other older residents. He didn't throw crap or urine-soaked diapers at us. He threw words. But he knew how to cut them, and he cut deep. Our first encounter happened when I had to check on him and make sure he was taking his medication. It was a beautiful evening, and I found Mr. Thompson in his room, casually sitting in his recliner. He was looking out the window, his back to the door, and he didn't bother to turn around and look at me as I entered. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," I greeted him. "Hey, fresh meat," he spat back with a resentful tone. I gritted my teeth and tried to sound polite as I replied, "My name is Anna, but..." "Fresh meat," he interrupted me. You won't last a month, so I won't bother learning your name. So why are you here, fresh meat? I explained the reason, and he pointed to the empty pill bottle on the nightstand beside him. Then he looked out the window at the sunset again, without another word, so I took my leave. The first 3 weeks passed like this. I went to his room here and there, he made some snarky remarks to insult me, and I stayed silent. It was clear he didn't want anyone around him, especially not me, but I was never one to give up, and I didn't want to bow to an old bastard with a vendetta against happiness itself. "Are you still here?" he asked in the 4th week as I passed by his room to change his bedding. "My God, woman, you're as dumb as you are pretty." He sat back in his recliner. Most of his evenings and nights were spent there. During the day, he was outside or in the common room, terrorizing anyone he met. But as dusk fell, he retreated to his room and stared out the window until he fell asleep in the recliner. I ignored his comment and approached the bed with fresh sheets and new pillowcases. "What? Did you swallow your tongue? Do you forget how words work?" He pressed on. I pulled off the old sheet and threw it on the floor, even though it wasn't particularly dirty. That wouldn't be a big surprise. Honestly, the only thing that surprises me is that you even learned to speak. Well, I advise against reacting the way I did, reacting like I did. At this point, I should have thrown the rag and left, but I didn't. After 2 weeks of daily abuse, I broke down. I carelessly threw the fresh sheets onto the bed and stomped over to his recliner. "Listen, you dried-up sack," I waved my arms at him. "I don't know what your problem is, but I don't need this kind of treatment in my life. No wonder your family left you. With an attitude like that, I would have thrown you into a nursing home at the first chance." I hurled insult after insult at him, digging deep to bring out the ugliest side of me. Fully expecting Mr. Thompson to lash out against me as well, he just stood there and took it all. With each colorful word that left my mouth, the corner of his lips curled into a more satisfied grin. I only stopped when I ran out of breath, and he waited a moment to make sure I was done. "What was your name again?" he asked. "Anna?" "Anna," he repeated, rolling each letter off his tongue. "You know what? I like you." And that was it. He went back to staring out the window, and I could get my work done in peace. I regretted the outburst for a while, fearing it might backfire and get me fired, but Mr. Thompson didn't tell anyone. It was our little secret. Every day after that, he grinned when he saw me. He still threw quips my way, but it was different, more cheerful. He didn't try to insult or push me away, but just tease. But I could work with him without breaking down in tears afterward, so I saw that as a win. After a while, I began to tease him back. He called me his insult of the day. I called him mine. We laughed it off and moved on. What I mean is, we developed this strange bond, and I actually started to have fun. I looked forward to it. We talked about nothing else. I knew nothing about him at first, and he knew nothing about me. But in my eyes, that just added to the charm. Life went on, and before I knew it, I had been working there for years. Rumors about Mr. Thompson circulated. Everyone had their theories and beliefs, but I couldn't confirm or deny any of them. The man was still as much of a mystery to me as on the first day. Then, about a month ago, things started to change. He made fewer comments. He spent more and more time in his room, isolating himself from everyone. Mr. Thompson had always been very independent for someone his age, but he began needing help with things, and I could see it was eating him up inside. I didn't mind, that was my job, but the man had his pride. He refused to see a doctor or get treated, so we all expected him to kick the bucket soon. A prospect that made most people in the nursing home happy, but I feared it. Still, I knew better than to try talking to him about it. One evening, before I went home, I checked on him. Mr. Thompson was sitting in his usual spot in the recliner, the curtains pulled aside, and the window wide open. The sun had already set, sinking deep below the horizon and casting a red hue on him as night fell. He didn't notice my presence until I stopped beside him. "Hey, Anna," he greeted, his voice a deep growl. I almost wanted to say, "Hey, fart cushion," but the sound of my name and the way he said it made me pause. For the first time in the many years I had known him, he sounded serious. A pit of fear formed in my stomach. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" His lips twisted into a smile that lit up his gaunt face. A dry, hoarse chuckle escaped his throat, but he left my question hanging in the air for a long time. "Heading home for the night?" he asked. "Yes." "Could you stay a little longer?" "Of course." I knew what that meant. Mr. Thompson felt his time was up, and he wanted someone by his side. I leaned forward to take his hand, but a bastard stays a bastard to the end. He pushed my hand away, so we stood there in awkward silence, watching the night fall outside. "You're the next best thing I have to a friend, Anna," he suddenly said. "The next best thing I have to a family." He let out another chuckle, but it sounded sad. God, I'm so pathetic. I placed a hand on his shoulder, and this time he didn't push it away. I had no idea what to say exactly. Mr. Thompson wasn't the type for sentimental speeches, so I ended up telling the truth. As direct as it was, I thought he would appreciate my honest opinion. "It's your fault you're a grumpy old bastard. You could have had many friends here, so why? Do you have plans tonight?" he asked, and I shook my head. "Then, can I answer your question with a story?" "Sure." He shifted in the recliner, thinking of the right words. I'd seen this before. They think they're ready to open up until the moment comes to actually do it. With a sigh, he surrendered to the situation and began to speak. Mr. Thompson was born in the 1940s in a small town in Ohio, right after World War II. He had an older brother and a father he couldn't remember. The first died as a child from an illness, and the second was drafted and died abroad while Mr. Thompson was still a baby. This left his mother to raise him alone, but they weren't the only ones in town struggling to make ends meet. Almost everyone else was too. Life back then was hard, especially for isolated communities like theirs. But I had a pretty good childhood, Mr. Thompson assured me. My mother did her best, worked herself to exhaustion, and went hungry most nights to make sure I didn't have to. He paused briefly, avoiding his gaze out the window to look me in the eyes. I could tell he was uncomfortable. Dwelling on the past caused him great sorrow. But after a long moment, he looked back at the dark world outside and continued. Despite his mother's best efforts, his childhood was short. Mr. Thompson had to grow up quickly, be reliable, help around the house, and find work. Back then, that wasn't unusual. Kids as young as 8 or 9 worked shoulder to shoulder with the adults. We didn't have much choice. Things like getting an education or waiting until adulthood were hardly more than pipe dreams. But fortunately, Mr. Thompson was tall for his age. At just 10 years old, he was bigger and stronger than his 15-year-old friends. He could handle his physical work, and an extra hand helped around the house. A second breadwinner, which did wonders for the household. "I still remember my first paycheck," he said with a sad smile. A small amount, but I was proud. My mother wanted me to spend it on myself to buy something nice, but I didn't. I bought a sack of flour so she could bake bread, and I used the fabric to make myself a new pair of shorts. I'm so sorry," I stammered. "Yes, me too." But time went on. Mr. Thompson worked over the years, living day by day. Difficulties were never far, but he faced them head on. the adults always tried to cut his wages, and other kids regularly tried to bully him because of his meager income. The first time that happened, I came home empty-handed, with a broken nose and torn lips. 5 of them had conspired against me. It was a dog-eat-dog world back then. When he was about 13 and his mother brought a new man home, Mr. Thompson hoped for a change. A chance to have a father, a role model, someone to teach him how to be a man himself. He thought life would get easier. How wrong I was, he said. This man was an alcoholic abuser, Mr. Thompson and his mother soon found out. His mother left before he did, but he recognized the signs. Although he was still working and bringing his income home, suddenly there was no more food. His mother always had bruises she tried to hide, and his stepfather was constantly drunk. When I came home again, beaten up by the older kids, I was hopeful for the first time. I thought he would step up and do something about it. And he didn't, I asked hesitantly. Mr. Thompson snorted. He beat me too because I was a coward, in his own words. It can't happen again, you understand? He said that next time I came home empty-handed, he would show me the real hell. Why didn't you run away or contact the authorities? Run away? Where? Mr. Thompson replied. And the authorities didn't care. He endured the abuse for his mother's sake. He couldn't leave her alone with his stepfather, but it gradually escalated. Soon his stepfather simply took Mr. Thompson's money. Then he publicly beat his mother. It didn't take long for him to regularly raise his hand to me, Mr. Thompson said, but it protected my mother, so I endured. On the nights I was beaten, she was safe. And those nights only became more frequent over time. At first, Mr. Thompson was beaten because he intervened and took his mother's place. Then, because he wasn't bringing enough money home. Then, for no reason at all. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke down, Mr. Thompson confessed. The other kids stole my money again, and I was afraid to go home that night. Afraid of what he would do to me, so I ran into the woods, looked for a place to sleep. And instead, I found this old well. Old well? I asked, not sure what that had to do with anything up to that point. Old well, Mr. Thompson confirmed. You know, a hole in the ground so people can get drinking water. I know what a well is. Anyway, he found this old well, a dilapidated thing long out of use and seriously falling apart. Mr. Thompson almost fell in as he leaned over the edge to look down. He threw a pebble in, but it never landed. Then he tried to spit into it and shout down the tube. It echoed long after, much longer than it should. Mr. Thompson listened in awe as his own voice echoed from the well for minutes, without getting quieter. But aside from the awe, it gave him an idea. I didn't like that. I did return home that night, Mr. Thompson said. Caught him beating my mother because I wasn't there, and he chased me when he saw me. Mr. Thompson led his stepfather out of town into the woods, further away from civilization, deeper and deeper among the trees, until he could still hear the faint echo of the well. I hid nearby and stayed still, he said. Waited until he found the well, and he did. He heard the echoes of my scream and thought I had fallen into the damn thing while I was hiding. The asshole laughed about it. His stepfather approached the well and leaned over the edge, still laughing. "Have you learned your lesson, you damn bastard?" Mr. Thompson imitated him. He didn't know I had learned my lesson. It was just not the lesson he wanted. Mr. Thompson stormed out of his hiding spot while his stepfather was distracted and ran towards him. "All it took was a single push," he said grimly. "A single push, and he fell over the edge. Fell headfirst into that abyss, screaming to the bottom. From that day on, his voice joined mine in the well." Authorities acted like they were searching for him for a few days, but no one really cared. He was just an alcoholic bastard, so everyone thought he had received his just punishment, that he had died somewhere in a ditch or that he had run away to seek greener pastures and other people he could terrorize. No one suspected us, Mr. Thompson said. Not my mother, who was too weak to fight back, and they just saw me as a kid. In their eyes, none of us could kill an adult man. With him out of the picture, Mr. Thompson's life improved somewhat. He still earned a meager wage, and the other kids still bullied him, but at least he could find some peace in his own home. I started going to that well every day first, then every other day, then at most once a week. But the screams never stopped, day and night. They got quieter, barely a whisper in the wind, but I could still hear them. Didn't it scare you? It scared me, Mr. Thompson admitted, but I also saw the possibilities. That answer frightened me. I paused for a moment, wondering if I should end the night, end Mr. Thompson's confession, and leave. But I was also curious whether for good or bad. Next came the kids who bullied me, Mr. Thompson continued. It took me a long time to muster the courage to even consider it, but enough abuse can drive reasonable men to unreasonable actions. The gang consisted of 5 members. Their leader was 19 years old, and the youngest was about Mr. Thompson's age. The others were all in between. Desperate street kids, Mr. Thompson called them, either orphans or with family situations similar to his own, driving them to run away and defy the world. But they were lazy, Mr. Thompson said. They took the easy way out, theft, fraud, bullying other kids, just like they did to me. The community wasn't happy with them, but they never targeted adults, so they were tolerated. Until they beat Mr. Thompson for the 100th time, and he decided he had enough. I just wanted to get rid of their leader, he said. Thought their little clique would fall apart without him, but I couldn't separate them. Mr. Thompson tried to challenge him to a duel outside of town, but he came with the rest of his gang and was furious. You could see the bloodlust in his eyes for miles. I knew they would hellfire me like never before, so I had no choice. All 5 had to go. Mr. Thompson ran away, and just like his stepfather, they chased him into the woods. He hid again near the well, and as they approached to inspect the echoing voices, Mr. Thompson repeated his earlier trick. I pushed the oldest boy first, he said with a stone-hard voice. Then, before the others had a chance to get smarter, I pushed the second oldest too. The others were smaller. I could handle them. They tried to run away, escape with their lives, but I couldn't let them go. Mr. Thompson chased after them and caught the youngest first. He tripped the boy from behind and stepped on his knee to break it, then moved on. He grabbed the second boy by the shoulders and threw him headfirst against a tree, breaking his neck. I pressed the last one and put him in a chokehold. He kicked with his legs, scratched at my arm, tried to bite me a few times. When he realized he couldn't break free, he started pleading, begging for his life. He told me he wouldn't say a single word about what happened there. He pleaded until his legs fell over the edge. The boy with the broken neck followed, and the one with the broken leg staggered a considerable distance before Mr. Thompson caught up with him. But he went through with it, and that night the well received 5 more voices. Mr. Thompson paused his story for a moment and stared into the distance. At first, I thought he would give me a break, some time to process what I'd heard, or that he was searching for words. I also looked outside, and the silhouette of a tree against the starry night sky swayed in the distance. An echoing scream followed. "We don't have much time left. I have to hurry," Mr. Thompson whispered. I was frozen by his side as he continued the story, in shock, in fear, not knowing what would happen next or what I should do. I'd heard a few confessions up to that point, but none even remotely compared to Mr. Thompson's. He confessed to 6 murders in as many minutes, and I was sure a few more would come until he was done with me. "The guilt ate me up inside," he confessed. I went to the well every single day, fighting the urge to jump in myself. No one missed these children, and no one in the community blamed Mr. Thompson. He wasn't the only one who had been bullied by them, and on some level, everyone was glad they were gone. A lesser problem in their lives, so they were happy to pretend the five had run off to conduct bigger heists. I was depressed about it for years, but I kept telling myself I had to do it, that my life was better now. Lies I only half believed, but they got me out of bed in the morning. Another tree swayed outside, followed by a howl. And let me guess, it was all too real. Mr. Thompson nodded. My mother disappeared one evening, and we never found her. The city police took it a bit more seriously, but they couldn't find a single clue. No witnesses, no suspects, nothing. But Mr. Thompson knew exactly where he could find her, or what was left of her. After a long journey back to his hometown and a trek through the woods, his worst fears were confirmed. His mother's voice joined the tortured chorus in the well. I broke down right then. Wept the whole night alone in those woods. It should have been me, not her. However, he did return home, albeit only for his girlfriend and soon-to-be wife. She was pregnant. They would soon have their first child, and Mr. Thompson wanted a better life for her than he had grown up with. He would be there for his children, for his wife, to ensure they were well. They married quietly, with few friends, and even fewer family members for a decent wedding, and their child was born a few months later. The most beautiful baby girl in the world, Mr. Thompson explained with a sparkle in his eyes. Holding her, hearing her cry, that was all I ever wanted, enough to justify everything I had done and gone through in a heartbeat. Another tree swayed outside, and something took shape in the underbrush at the edge of the property. I let out a gasp, and Mr. Thompson grabbed me. He grabbed my forearm and held me tight as I tried to pull away. "We have a few minutes left," he said calmly. "And don't worry, it's not here for you. You're safe." He continued with the rest of his story, and I had to muster all my courage to split my attention between him and whatever was out there. I cherished every moment with my wife and daughter, but you know how things go. She grew up in a heartbeat. Before I knew it, she was speaking her first words, taking her first steps, moments I couldn't be prouder of as a father. The thing roared, a throaty sound that shook my bones. A dying animal was my first thought, a rabid coyote or a fox in heat. It took a step forward into the faint light circle surrounding the nursing home, and I saw a human face, then another and another, distorted in agony and held together to form a gigantic head. Then this thing came back again, Mr. Thompson said, raising a hand to point at the approaching beast. More screams at night, more screams and howls. I knew what it wanted, but I couldn't have it. Myself or my family. Another step brought its neck and torso into view, pulsating muscles crossed randomly, skin stretched tight until it pulled taut. Dozens of human arms randomly sticking out. Its countless eyes moved in all directions, scanning, searching. I knew I had to do something before it was too late, to either get rid of it or appease it, and I knew what it wanted. "What?" I asked, stammering and shaking with fear. "People, bodies, victims," Mr. Thompson replied. "More of them." I fed its appetite, and now it was hungry. If I didn't give it what it wanted, it would take it itself. Take my world from me. I didn't want to do it. I tried to stop myself until the very last moment. But I ran out of time and was frantic about my family, so I returned to town. For a moment, I wished my eyes could do the same as the creatures. I wanted to turn around and look at Mr. Thompson, see his face, but I didn't dare look away. Every muscle in my body was tense, holding me in place. I could barely breathe. It took another step forward, and all those dead small eyes fixed on the window, the room, me, and Mr. Thompson. "I kidnapped someone," Mr. Thompson said, his voice fraying at the edges, turning into a scream. "An older man who lived all alone. I knew him, knew he had been widowed for decades, and he knew me. He barely resisted when I tied him up and gagged him. I expected him to plead like the kids. I expected him to fight me. But the silence, it was somehow worse. Did he know about that thing?" I managed to squeeze out a question. "What? No, of course not," Mr. Thompson replied. "He was just old and frail, and he knew he couldn't do anything to stop me. Maybe he had long given up on life just like I had, I don't know." The rest of the monster came into view as it approached the open window, and there was so much more of it than I had expected. So many legs moving randomly, slamming into the lawn at awkward angles to push the body forward. It felt surreal, as if this window were a screen and I was watching a cheap horror movie with even cheaper special effects. At night, I dragged the old man out of town and through the woods. I took him to the well, said a short prayer for his soul, and pushed him over the edge. He went down without a sound. The monster stopped a few feet from the window and stretched its head forward. At this point, I was practically useless, more of a decoration than an active participant. Mr. Thompson let go of me and tried to stand, failing twice. His old bones had no strength left, but he still had his will. On the third attempt, he stood up, though he was a bit shaky. "I returned to my wife and daughter afterward," he said, taking a step towards the window, "and everything was fine for a while. Seeing her smile grow up, having her by my side kept the guilt away. They were my world, and I was ready to do anything to keep my world from falling apart." The monster laughed. One of its many faces moved across its skin, pressing against the rest until it came to the forefront. A wide smile spread across its lips, replacing the agonizing expression. Next time the screams returned, I knew what I had to do, knew what the rest of my life would look like, what sins I had to commit. Every few years, I returned to this cursed town, kidnapped someone in the middle of the night and threw them into the well. The smile on the foremost face only got wider, but the rest didn't match. They began to whisper aggressively, their voices merging as they got louder. I kept doing it until my daughter grew up, until she found a boy she wanted to marry and moved out, until all those townspeople left behind to be an empty shell that the forest could reclaim. And I called it a well-done job. I thought my daughter was safe, and I could finally let the monster take me, that I would finally atone for all my sins. Mr. Thompson closed the gap to the window, and so did the monster. It thrust its many arms into the room, hands large and small reaching for the air, trying to grab him. "And what happened to her?" I asked. The question felt strange, as if it was spoken by someone a million miles away, completely detached from the situation. Mr. Thompson stretched out one of his arms but paused and turned to me. "What do you think happened, Anna?" he asked in a serious tone. "What do you think made me spend the rest of my life on the run? Made me tired of talking to people and making friends?" I held back my answer, at least because I still had another question. "Why are you telling me all this?" Mr. Thompson grinned, the same mischievous, murky smile I had grown accustomed to from him. "Because I'm a selfish old bastard," he said matter-of-factly. "I wanted at least one person to know and maybe miss me, and now you're doing that." He took the final step, bringing him within reach of the monster, and it grabbed his arm with 100 fingers. The many eyes looked past Mr. Thompson directly at me. "Thank you, Anna," Mr. Thompson said, his back to me. "You can go now, that would be best." I didn't argue. I slowly backed up to the door. My head felt heavy, my mind racing, and my legs felt like shaky stilts, 100 feet long. But I did it. I reached the door, walked back into the hallway, and gently closed it. Mr. Thompson watched me the whole time, a peaceful smile on his lips until the latch clicked. The rest of the night was a blur. I wandered to the break room with tears streaming down my face, but I didn't even notice I was crying until I tried to light a cigarette and a tear fell onto it. My hands trembled like an earthquake, as did the rest of me. I smoked about half the pack, waited and prayed that this thing would go away so I could too. A few hours later, I finally gathered the courage to shoot it out of the nursing home and to my car. I drove home groggy, my eyes darting at every little movement, and I couldn't sleep a single minute until dawn broke. But I returned to the nursing home for my next shift, looking like a ghost. The police were there interrogating everyone about Mr. Thompson's disappearance, and I lied to them. I couldn't tell them the truth, not when I didn't even know where that damn well was. So yes, I lied until they left me alone. I lied until they got into their car and drove away. Everyone else was terribly happy that Mr. Thompson was finally gone, and I stuck out among them like a red flag. I sat in his recliner, writing this as the sunset approached, and realized he was right on both counts. He was a selfish old bastard, and he left behind someone who missed him. If there was one thing Nick and Darren were always passionate about, it was hiking. No matter how dreadful our day jobs made us feel, an extended trek up a mountain always left us mentally clearer. From the summit, looking down on everything seemed so tiny that our problems barely mattered in the grand scheme of things. The Appalachian Mountains, the densely forested mountain range stretching through Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, were our favorite hiking area. Whether it was Mount Mitchell, Clingman's Dome, or the rugged trails of the Great Smoky Mountains, we had likely explored them all. Despite the plethora of options, there was one issue that particularly annoyed Darren. These trails were always overcrowded. I don't consider myself anti-social, but Darren had a point. It became genuinely frustrating when you wanted to quietly enjoy your surroundings and slow your pace, only to be overtaken by a large group of breathless hikers, followed by another group of slower, louder hikers trailing behind. It felt more like a bustling shopping mall pedestrian zone than a serene mountain path. While the crowd did provide a sense of safety, no wild animals approached the commotion. Hiking simply became chaotic. We were at Nick's house in Asheville, enjoying a few beers Darren had brought from the Wildflower Brewery in Portland. Darren had only moved to Portland last year, while Nick and I had spent our entire lives hiking around the Appalachians. Darren frequently visited his parents in Knoxville. I hadn't heard much about the city, aside from its vibrant music scene. Still, they brewed some damn good beer. After we had downed most of the alcohol, Nick proposed a solution to our hiking dilemma. His suggestion? A hike to an old settlement that wasn't marked on any maps. It had never been completed. No matter how many people worked on it, nothing ever materialized, and people never returned. Allegedly, it was located in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, allowing us to experience the hike feeling we had always cherished. There were small rumors that this place still existed, according to locals in our neighboring region. He insisted that we go off the beaten path and search for it, as he had some clues from what he called unconventional journalism. I was always skeptical whether he meant the dark web or something else. Nick still dreamed of making it big in local journalism by presenting a story that would shock the people in our town. I, with my big dreams in landscape photography, wanted little to do with abandoned or otherwise disturbing scenes. I wanted to take photos of beautiful landscapes and sell them. So far, that hadn't made a fortune, and I was slowly falling apart. I had a dream and wanted money and recognition. We all had plenty of free time, having booked vacation days in case we wanted to do something. Nick wanted 2 weeks for this trip, which would take up most of my vacation days, and I wanted about 3 days. We compromised and decided that the hike would last a week. If we reached our destination sooner, we would leave earlier. Nick was by far the boldest of the 3 of us, and I was the most reserved. Nick told me to stop worrying and assured me that we would pack and prepare accordingly. I knew we would be camping overnight, and that made me uneasy. Darren helped Nick find access to this so-called unnamed settlement on the map, and it didn't take long. They had their eyes set on a secluded part of the Appalachians. According to Nick's research, the settlement would be near the mountains, if not directly on them. It was far, probably farther than we had ever hiked before. We would cross into North Carolina and park near the Smith River. We would follow the river until we found a nearby mountain and then hike up it. It was close to the border with Virginia, so the population would likely be minimal at worst and empty at best. It would just be the 3 of us searching for something strange in the middle of nowhere, without anyone bothering us. I made a list of all the gear I deemed necessary. Nick insisted that I bring my camera since its specifications were higher than his. Darren reminded me to take his sturdy GPS device, as we weren't consulting a hiking website to find a trail and might want to mark interesting spots. The mountains didn't seem steep enough to require climbing gear, but I wrote it down anyway. I also packed an axe and some bear spray. The 2 slowly convinced me, plus I trusted them. Nick and Darren had been scouts and had plenty of experience camping deep in the woods. I loved hiking, but I was also very afraid of things like bears and lynxes or anything unknown that you might encounter far off a trail. And what we ultimately found would confirm my fears. On the morning of the hike, we all piled into Nick's spacious SUV and drove northwest for a little over 8 hours. I helped Nick by taking the wheel for the last 2 hours so he could relax. The sun was almost completely set when we reached Smith River. A parking lot greeted us, and there was a worn-down lodge right by the riverbank. We bought some extra snacks and smaller necessities for the trip there. Nick asked the older man running the lodge if he had seen or heard anything about the unnamed settlement we were searching for. The older man looked confused. Nick tried to ask more questions, but the lodge owner became irritated and sent us away. Across the street was an entrance to a nature park, but I saw no one going in or out. Overall, there were only 2 cars in the entire parking lot, and I counted a lone car passing by the lodge on the highway. We decided to take a shortcut west of the river, as it would likely be a long journey to reach the next mountain. The next mountain seemed at least a small hike on its own, maybe 4 hours. We began the trek with the last hours of sunlight lighting our way. The area itself was beautiful, as is typical in the Appalachians. Long, deep green grassy strips stretched for miles, and the forest edge was dense with cedar and pine growth. It felt much more like Virginia. On the other side of the river, I noticed construction machinery just beyond the forest edge. None of them were moving, and by the sounds, they didn't seem to be operational. I assumed they were empty, to our relief. We saw some animals, namely a few raccoons and deer. I was pretty sure I also saw a moose. Nothing that made me uneasy. The fact that these animals were calmly wandering around gave me some relief. They probably wouldn't stay if predators were nearby, right? After about 2 hours of hiking, we decided to set up camp. Our tent was large, as it was meant for 8 people. With the help of a campfire for lighting, we set up the tent in minutes. The river was peaceful and soothing to listen to, as were the birds and the chirping insects. We grabbed a drink, ate some snacks, and decided to call it a night. I noticed a truck parked behind a few trees on the other side of the shallow river. That truck was alone, and from what I could see, it seemed to have been there for a few days. It was strange that they were so out here. Their construction machinery didn't follow them. Were construction workers building something, or looking for something? I hoped that construction workers wouldn't kick us out in the morning. Fortunately, Nick wasn't snoring, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. But when I woke up around 3 a.m., I noticed that Darren was awake and looking alert. I sneaked past Nick and asked Darren what was up. He said he could hear footsteps outside the tent. I decided to listen with him. There was hardly any chirping from insects and birds anymore. It was as if most had fled something nearby. A few minutes later, I also heard the footsteps. They were quick, like someone sprinting in short bursts. It sounded like two people, right outside the forest edge on our riverside. I heard a little giggling from one of the individuals, if I could call them that, outside. I was scared, just like Darren, but he tried to rationalize that maybe they were construction workers, given the equipment on the other side. Luckily for us, after hearing the sounds wandering about 50 meters away, they ran back into the trees about 10 minutes later. That didn't sound like normal people, and I would prefer normal people over those things any day. Darren and I didn't get much sleep that night. In the morning, we told Nick about it. He was surprised, even happy. We had explored around our tent and left it, and he was pleased about it. He insisted that we were on the right path and that if people were coming out of the forest, they must be members of that settlement. Darren argued that Nick should be cautious, as he remembered the sounds these beings made. It was too strange to be human. That intrigued Nick even more. We knew we couldn't sway him, but it felt dangerous or wrong to be out here. Sure, we had the numbers, but what did these beings have? Nick suggested that I take a look around our location and start our investigative hike into the forest. I knew I couldn't convince him otherwise, so I reluctantly agreed, and he and Darren took down the tent and packed for our tour while I scouted the area where I had heard the footsteps. Right from the start, something was off as I detected a smell that reeked of blood. My eyes darted quickly around the area. I was in search mode. I didn't want to draw attention in case something dangerous was nearby, so I stayed silent. I found my first clue when I discovered a name tag from what I thought was a forestry company. Carefully, I picked it up and noticed how dirty the tag was. It had bloodstains. Michael Cooper was the only readable part of the tag, aside from the tree trunk on the name tag. Right next to the name tag on the ground lay bloody, torn clothes that had been thrown at the trees. There were also several dry blood handprints on many of the trees, almost forming a pattern. Between the slender trees was a lot of space, and the deeper I looked into the trees, the darker it became, even on a clear morning. Whoever Michael Cooper was, I doubted he was still alive. It also didn't look like a good path to follow. I called the guys over and showed them my discovery. I had a dilemma in mind, considering what had happened the night before. Should we call the authorities and leave them to conduct a 2-hour hike in the middle of nowhere to probably search for a dead man? Or should we investigate ourselves to earn the title of great journalists, despite the danger? Part of me wanted neither, but would we be hailed as heroes or slandered if we ignored the whole thing for our investigation? As I pondered my dilemma, I noticed something that didn't look right on one of the trees. Carefully, I crept deeper into the forest, with Nick and Darren right behind me. I held my bear spray tightly. I heard a humming from the tree, almost like a vibration. From a distance, I could see that the tree had a different color and a very strange bump at the top. It almost looked like human arms were stretched out from the top. Something was also stinking. The smell got worse as we got closer. It smelled like someone had smeared it on the tree. The sound became clearer. Flies were buzzing around. Was it an animal carcass on a strange, red tree? As we got closer, I gained the clarity I needed, but I wished I hadn't. The branches of the tree were torn near the ground, and a mutilated body was bound in pieces to the tree with rough ropes. The severed head was distorted and resembled the name tag. It was Michael Cooper. This grotesque construction stood like a sort of sentinel in the forest. It looked like it was marking its territory. Nick and Darren, despite their love for bloody horror movies, looked just as disgusted as I did. A strong gut feeling told us to run for our lives. But what did that mean? This gruesome sight gave us a solution. Investigate a little, then leave, inform the authorities, and hope they would eliminate whatever it was that had done this. I took the GPS and marked our first camp. I thought we might need to fall back here in case things went south. It was a cozy spot, and nothing about what we planned was cozy. Then it was my task to mark the location of these murderers. The forest grew eerily quiet as the three of us packed our essentials, without the tent, and prepared for a quick trek deeper into this forest. I felt surprisingly secure with these two. They were both 5 years older than me, and had once again more experience. I was at the age where I wanted to stop being so cowardly, even against logic. Tracking a twisted murderer seemed like a damn good start. We didn't have firearms. The next thing we had in terms of weapons was bear spray and the axe I had brought, which was getting very dull. I thought it would work as a bludgeon. We still had plenty of snacks and a decent amount of drinks. We just wanted to plan for an hour, and I set a silent alarm to ensure that. We still had plenty of daylight, so we began our exploration. The breeze was soothing as we cautiously moved forward. It was also the only sound we heard. All small animals and insects had disappeared. Was there danger nearby? The three of us kept our eyes constantly moving to ensure we weren't making much noise as we advanced. I noticed the GPS batteries were getting weaker, so I planned to use it sparingly. I packed some tape that I used to discreetly mark trees, just in case. 10 minutes later, we found another one of those gruesome corpse sculptures. This one was much older, as much of the flesh had already decayed. It smelled terrible. Even Nick felt sick. He went into a nearby bush to vomit. We all somehow knew what we were getting into as we could smell it from afar. We were on the right track, at least. As I checked on Nick, I heard quickly cracking branches on the ground in the distance. Everyone ducked for cover as the sounds crossed our path ahead. They weren't too close, as I could tell, but this forest wasn't dense. Fortunately, the bushes on the ground were large enough to hide behind. Darren took cover behind a bush directly to my right, and Nick and I stayed under the same bush. I heard the familiar giggling from the night before, forcing me to stick my head out and take a look. About 100 meters ahead, I saw 3 naked individuals. Their movements were twitchy and fast, like spiders. They were hunched much more than the average person, looking unnatural. They slowed their pace and sniffed the air like animals. All had long hair, and from what I could see of their bodies, they were all female. Their heads were turned away, but one suddenly began to rotate in my direction. Holy shit! I quickly ducked back and prayed they didn't see me. I heard the giggling coming from all 3. I started trembling and refused to move. My heart began to race, as if I had run a marathon. Branches started to crack, but I couldn't tell if they were approaching me. My eyes darted around, and I kept looking to see if Darren saw them too. I signaled him to stay lower as I saw him move his body. Nick brilliantly decided to carefully bend some of the branches to form a peephole. I did the same. I heard grunting and other strange noises from these beings. As I looked through the shrubbery, I got a good view of one of these things. A naked humanoid woman, quite tall, was slowly shuffling through the area while the other 2 stayed back. The hair on her head was slimy and tangled, Her skin looked almost hard. Her face was distorted, with a near caveman appearance, and some of her teeth stuck out of her mouth, too long and curved to stay. She had dried bloodstains on her face and body. I quickly closed the hole I had made in the bushes and held the axe and bear spray firmly in each hand. I didn't want to be eaten today. I could now hear their steps, how they were cracking branches and moving gravel. A few more large steps, and they would be right in front of us. I handed the axe to Nick, and his trembling hands took it. I looked at Darren, who motioned for us to look back at the thing. I definitely didn't want to, but Nick started again, shaping his peephole, and he quickly showed me through which I should also look. I saw the woman crawling back on all fours to the others. After a grunt, she too fell on all fours and began to run deeper into the forest, like a primate. It was unsettling to watch, and I just wanted to abort this whole adventure so we could save ourselves. Nick urged me to take photos as they ran away, but I didn't move. This wasn't the work of a serial killer, but of a tribe of humanoids. They were obviously isolated for a reason. We waited a few minutes before emerging from our hides. We didn't hear much, so the coast must be clear. I tried to convince the others to turn back, but they said they needed more evidence and wanted something harder. Specifically, they were looking for the place where these creatures lived. I understood their desire, but these things were clearly hostile. They were also fast. Would the three of us even be enough? Did they have tools, or did they tear their victims apart? We didn't know much. Nick was fascinated by these beings. He said it was definitely them, and that we would have the big story in no time. He was clearly the eager one in the group, as Darren was somewhat more hesitant than before. After a short catch of breath, I nervously followed the two deeper into the forest. We had half an hour before my alarm went off, and I would do my best to stick to it. These things we saw left footprints. They were large, likely to make a Bigfoot witness proud. Their scraping ankles also left marks on the ground. As another gust of wind blew through the forest, I tried to take in my surroundings to calm myself. The wind only moved the underbrush slightly, and the leaves and pines rustled in the breeze. It was the only thing I could hear, giving me a brief moment of peace. The forest itself was beautiful and green, given the circumstances. I kept an eye on the timer and marked the trees accordingly. These things wouldn't hide, would they? The gruesome statues we kept encountering proved we were heading in the right direction. There was even a corpse bound to a tree that looked almost completely eaten. The corpse itself was patched together with a mix of dirty clothes and something sturdy like tangled denim. That was my best guess, as much of the shirt and jeans on the corpse were almost completely torn off. I was horrified, as they hung quite high above the ground. It was just another thing I had to be aware of. If these damned beings could climb trees, we would be even more vulnerable. Given their size, we would at least hear them climb, I hoped. Darren said he would keep an eye on the trees while Nick and I focused on the front. Eventually, there was a gap in the forest edge that we quickly reached. It looked like a field. We would be exposed and definitely observed if we weren't already. We heard primitive sounds from further ahead again. Instinctively, we knew what to do. The three of us ducked behind some cover as we saw what awaited us in the field. Darren deployed the peephole strategy, and this time I pulled out a pair of binoculars. In the distant distance, something seemed large, and I wanted to observe it safely. I looked through the binoculars and immediately went pale as I saw what was down there. In the field ahead, I saw an abandoned dump truck and a few heavily rusted vans. These things must date back several decades. They didn't look like they belonged to our time, and were so unused that nature had begun to reclaim them. Weeds and tall grass overtook the ground around the old vehicles. These creatures patrolled around them. With my panicked brain, I counted at least 18. They resembled the ones we had seen before, with a few exceptions. The male humanoids I saw had painted bodies and wore some bones as armor. Their teeth sticking out from their heads looked as if they were carved, like perfect daggers. There were also shorter humanoids running around, looking mutated, some of them having too many fingers or nipples. Seeing one running around while devouring a severed human arm sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but these beings ate humans. I could see piles of corpses, and not far from them was another pile of bones. Given the clothing, I'd say it was the forestry team and people working on new roads. I saw 4 adult humanoids picking up a corpse and beginning to pull the limbs with significant force. Some even used their teeth to finish the job. They tossed meat scraps to the smaller ones, who eagerly ate them off the ground without using their hands. The creepiest part was that the trucks were surrounded by massive structures resembling the skeleton of a native lodge. Very minimalist frameworks, with skin pieces as coverings. Somehow, pieced together to hold, I saw various skin tones combined, some even had hair on them. Bones were also used in some of the constructions. There were also a few of these lodges between which the humanoids shuffled. In the middle of the lodges was a huge pile that looked like clothing, bags, even food and bottles. The clothing came in all different shapes, colors, and sizes. Much of the food looked spoiled, and the bottles resembled something from the early 1950s. Didn't these things know how to use them, let alone what they were? No wonder it wasn't on the map. Everyone and everything sent to build this place probably met an early end like what we were witnessing. I guess people back then decided to limit their losses and abandon development. But these cannibals, where did they come from? It was clear we had found a village, a damned cannibal village in the middle of nowhere. I dropped the binoculars in shock. We had our evidence. Nick just needed to take a snapshot, and we were out. I handed Nick my trembling camera and asked him to just blindly take a photo of the field so we could start our escape. I looked behind me to ensure I could see a tape mark, which I did. I placed it right next to the hanging man. Our escape plan was now. It was bright daylight, and I wanted to take advantage of that. I made sure to quickly mark our location on the GPS. My task was done. Now we had to leave. Darren stared into the field with the binoculars, his face quickly shifting from curious to contorted to a look of disgust. I started pulling at their bulky butts as I felt my alarm begin to vibrate. It was my alarm, and it was playing a loud tone. Did something in my pocket crank up my ringtone? Maybe it was the multiple jumps into the hideout, luckily for me. I quickly turned it off. Time was up. I hoped that if there was a God who had somehow created these things, he would hear my prayers and not draw the cannibals' attention to us. I heard no change in the inhuman grunting and clattering from the field. A massive, loud gust of wind, almost blowing my phone out of my hands, hit us. Given what I had seen, a breeze in the forest no longer calmed me. Darren handed the binoculars back to me. As he turned to me, he suddenly recoiled. Then I heard something moving in the forest behind us. He immediately grabbed my axe and held it tightly. I had the bear spray ready to see this. I didn't want to turn around, but for my life I knew I had to. I did it quickly to get it behind me, my heart racing faster than ever before. Right next to the hanging man was a smaller cannibal who was feasting on the last remains of the corpse. Then, with a curious grunt, his gray, protruding eyes fixed on me. There is a small plot of land, about 130 to 160 feet long, between my house and the next building, a senior living facility named Sunset Gardens. I have been living for approximately 10 months in my single-family home in a suburb of Chicago, together with my wife, Karen, and our 7-year-old daughter, Catherine. Our neighborhood is somewhat secluded compared to the rest of the city, nestled in a quiet residential area with plenty of greenery. Until recently, we had never noticed that we lived directly next to a senior living home. It was even a selling point for the house, but aside from that, we never had a reason to really pay attention to the presence of the facility. Everything began with a panicked scream from my daughter's room in the middle of the night. Karen and I were instantly awake and rushed into Catherine's room to see what was wrong. In the corner stood an older woman, wearing only a bra and underwear. She stood there with wide-open eyes, as if she was straining even more to open them. Her hair was white and patchy. The remaining strands were thin and wild. Her skin hung loosely over her bones and was wrinkled, and her veins were bright blue and clearly visible. Karen let out a startled scream as we looked into Catherine's room and immediately hurried back to our bedroom to get her phone and call the police. I told Catherine that everything was okay, and she hid trembling in the far corner of her bed. The woman simply stood in the corner opposite the wall, and even as I spoke, she did not avert her gaze, which was fixed on my daughter. Catherine had curled up at the very back of her bed, tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am," I asked in as calm a tone as I could muster. "Ma'am, are you lost?" I really didn't know what to say. What do you say to an intruder in your own home when you truly believe they have no malicious intent? The woman kept her strained face directed at Catherine, and I thought her eyes might pop out of her head. "Ma'am," I said this time more firmly. The woman turned her head towards me and bared her teeth like a rabid dog. Her mouth was a disheveled mess. Obviously, she had dentures that she hadn't brought with her. It was only then that I remembered we lived a field away from the senior home. I called Karen back into the room and asked her to get my phone. She came back, already in the process of informing the police. While I kept an eye on the seemingly wild woman in the corner of Catherine's room, who was now directing her gaze back to Catherine, I searched for the senior home's phone number online. A receptionist answered the call, and I explained the situation. I was informed that indeed a woman had gone missing, and the senior home had been locked down after it was discovered she was missing. Due to the fascination the woman seemingly had for Catherine, we hadn't dared to move her from her bed. But as we stood there, the woman's breathing became heavier and more threatening. I placed myself between Catherine and the woman and asked Karen to stand behind me and get Catherine out of the room. The woman's eyes never left Catherine. About 5 minutes later, there was a knock at our door. Without saying much due to privacy laws, the staff from the senior home who came to pick up the woman and the police who arrived later explained that the woman should never have been left alone, and that a simple miscommunication had led her to leave the facility. Catherine was understandably frightened, but overall the situation had ended without major incidents. About a month later, Catherine was finally sleeping in her own room again, and nothing had happened since that night. It was around 9 p.m., and Karen and I were sitting in the living room watching a movie. During the pawn shop scene in Pulp Fiction, Karen suddenly turned her head towards me. I looked at her but noticed she wasn't staring at me, but rather looking over me. I glanced in the direction her eyes were pointing and saw nothing but our window with the bright curtains. "Everything okay?" I asked. Yeah," she replied. "What?" I wanted to know why you suddenly became so attentive. I thought I saw someone passing by the window. "Great, more escapees from the senior home," I joked, which thankfully brought a smile to Karen's face. From my position on the couch, I could see a short hallway to the kitchen and was almost directly in line with one of the windows there. We were watching the movie again, and just as Butch grabbed the sword, I saw what Karen had seen a moment before. A silhouette was slowly and deliberately moving past the window. I quickly stood up and told Karen to call the police and go to Catherine's room. As she did, I grabbed one of my pocket knives and headed to the kitchen. When I entered the kitchen, I saw that the silhouette was now at the door leading outside. The figure raised both arms and pounded hard on the door, making the entire kitchen shake. It seemed the silhouette had noticed me because, although I wasn't entirely sure, it looked like she had turned her head to follow me as I slowly crossed the room. I kept an eye on the silhouette and planned to run outside and confront the person. A foolish plan, I know, but in the heat of the moment there was little time for strategic thinking. As I reached the door, I could only see a small part of the person in the window due to the angle. I took a deep breath and threw the door open, stepping outside. Somehow, the silhouette disappeared in the brief moment when I wasn't fixating my gaze. At this point, I was more confused than scared. Realistically, who would suspect something ghostly before assuming there's an explanation, even if it's not immediately obvious? I looked around and saw no one, so I assumed the person must have walked along the side of the house. Cautiously, I stepped in that direction, the knife in hand. With another deep breath, I stuck my head around the corner of our house and saw someone standing there, still just a silhouette in the moonlight. "Hey!" I shouted with much less strength than I'd planned. The silhouette simply stood there. As I slowly approached, I took my phone out of my pocket, turned on the flashlight and shone it in their direction. What I found was a man, no older than his late 80s. He had stringy white hair down to his shoulders and was wearing nothing but a thin bathrobe that fluttered in the slight breeze. His skin was extremely pale and hung loosely from his face, and saliva dripped from his mouth onto the grass. He was simply staring at the window on the second floor of the house, the same window that led to Catherine's room. As I got closer, I tried to communicate with the man as calmly as possible, but he just continued staring at the ground. When I was only a few meters away, I shone the light next to his face and saw that he had deep, dark purple eye circles under his eyes, so pronounced that it almost looked like he had been beaten. His nose was bright red, and a stream of mucus was flowing from it, and his lips, except for the areas where the mucus was running down, were cracked and covered with dried blood. His eyes were a very pale blue, almost white. At that moment, I heard something in the distance, a scream. My ears perked up, and I listened in case whatever it was would make more noise. I heard indistinct screams getting closer. Eventually, I could make them out. They were calling Dad. Shortly after, I saw the flash of flashlights on the street in front of our house. At that moment, I heard people calling. A man and a woman came running with flashlights in hand, visibly relieved. The married couple explained that they lived down the street and that their father had left the house shortly before. They sincerely apologized and began to lead their father back to their home. I went back inside to tell Karen that everything was okay, but as I walked up the stairs, I heard a crash at our front door, sounding as if it was being broken down. Under the crash, I could hear the man and the woman desperately calling, "Stop! Stop!" After a few seconds, it stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away from our door. I looked through the peephole and saw the man, the woman, and their father running away from the house again. The police arrived once more, but I explained the situation and we decided not to file a report since the situation, by all accounts, was just a confused old man who didn't know where he was. I mentioned the incident from the previous month, but none of us could explain it as anything other than a strange coincidence. A month later, it was around 3:30 a.m. I was awakened by an anxious Karen on the phone, which I quickly suspected was the police. I jumped out of bed and tried to figure out what was going on. Karen pointed to our bedroom window, which faces the senior home, and my heart sank. In the moonlight, I saw a number of silhouettes moving through the cornfield between our house and the senior home. The corn stalks were no taller than hip height, and there must have been about 40 silhouettes slowly sneaking past them. Karen asked the police to hurry as she ran to get into Catherine's room. I quickly went downstairs to ensure all doors and windows were locked. As I secured the last 2 windows, I noticed that the people at the front of the group of silhouettes had passed the cornfield and were now within the approximately 50 feet that separated them from our house. I realized they weren't walking quickly at all, and I finally connected the dots. They must all be residents of the senior home. I had installed a floodlight system on the side of our house that was motion activated, and just a few moments later the side of our house was bathed in yellow light. At that moment, I could clearly see the group approaching our house. Some of them were wearing normal everyday clothing, some only bathrobes, while others were completely naked. Those coming from the cornfield all had the same facial expression as the woman who had been in Catherine's room 2 months earlier, with eyes bulging out. I ran up the stairs to Catherine's room and got her and Karen, then led them to the basement, where I locked the door behind me with instructions not to open it at all. I would return with the key and open it myself once everything was safe. While I had my family safely in the basement, the elderly people had reached the house. As I moved away from the basement door, I heard glass breaking in the living room. Again, in a foolish move, I made my way toward the sound. I found an old woman with freshly appearing bloodstains around her mouth climbing through the broken window. I still remember the sound of shattering glass beneath her bare feet. More elderly people followed through, with more windows in the house breaking. The woman who had first crawled through the window bared her few teeth and let out a growl that soon turned into a scream. Behind her and around me, the rest of the group let out similar screams. It was deafening. I thought I just had to wait until the police arrived and do everything to keep them away from Karen and Catherine. So I decided to run up the stairs. Normally, that would be a foolish move, and nothing more than a horror movie cliché. But from our guest room window, there was a low roof from which I could quickly flee if needed. The old people slowly followed me, away from the basement door and up the stairs. I was about halfway through the upper hallway, walking backward, when I heard something behind me. I turned around and saw an old man approaching the hallway and another old man climbing through the window behind him. I didn't know what to do, so I just decided to run as fast as I could and push my way through the elderly people when suddenly a single scream echoed from an old woman on the first floor. At that scream, every movement around me stopped. The elderly people stood there for an eternity, and none of them looked at me. Those in our bedroom stared directly at the ground. Those in the guest room opposite looked out of this room into our bedroom, also at the ground, and those blocking my way back to the stairs seemed to be staring through the walls at the same point in our bedroom that everyone else was looking at. I later realized that our room was above the basement door, and with that, they all began to go down the stairs. As if I wasn't even there, those in the bedroom above me slowly walked down the stairs. Believing they wanted to go to the basement for some reason, I implemented my latest plan and pushed my way through the probably 15 elderly people blocking my path and found myself back on the first floor. I ran through the living room and saw an even larger group pounding against the basement door, all growling, all with a single-minded focus. I was frozen with fear and helplessness. I didn't know what to do, but at that moment my living room flashed with a burst of red and blue light. I stood still but began shouting for the police. "Help us, we're in here!" I realized the front door was locked, so I moved faster than ever, opened it with a jerk, and returned to the horde of rampaging elderly people that were now in my line of sight. A moment later, a police officer and a female officer with drawn weapons stormed in. They immediately called for backup after seeing the group of elderly people banging on our basement door and told me to step aside. The female officer moved first, and began using her baton to push the elderly people away from the basement door and toward the living room, while the other officer tried to push them outside. What happened next was admittedly all a blur. The elderly people let out another synchronized scream. At that moment, I saw one of the old men scratch the male officer and a woman behind him trying to bite him. The sound of a gunshot rang out from the basement door, and then one directly in front of me made my ears ring. The sounds of rapidly fired shots filled the entire house, sounding like the whole world. It was so loud. The male officer ordered me to go outside, and although I hesitated to leave my wife and daughter in the house without me, I ultimately obeyed. I stood there again, which seemed like an eternity but was no more than perhaps 30 seconds, when I finally saw Karen and Catherine being led out by the blood-soaked female officer. We were taken to the police station, where we gave our statements and explained the 2 incidents that had preceded this major event. We learned that all the staff at the senior home had been killed, except for 4 employees who were seriously injured. 27 of the 41 elderly people who had attacked our house were shot, 19 of whom died. The rest were overwhelmed and arrested by the first arriving officers and the backup that came shortly after Karen and Catherine were safely outside. They informed us that after the female officer had escorted my wife and daughter outside, the remaining elderly people, following the gunshots and the officers' attempts to knock them down to their knees with batons, had focused their attention on leaving the house. This fact, along with the fact that the first woman who had come into our house had gone to Catherine's room, and the fact that the man from the street next to our house had stopped and was staring at Catherine's window, led the police to believe that our daughter was the target. They have no idea why. Since then, we have rented an apartment. For those interested, the dates of the incidents were December 3rd, January 2nd, and January 31st. I don't know if there is any special significance to these dates that explains why these elderly people showed interest in my daughter on those particular days, but any help would be welcome. I'm just asking because there was about a month between each incident, and the approximately a month since the last incident is quickly approaching. Also, Gut, let's make one thing clear. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in the Easter Bunny, and I damn sure don't believe in any wooden creatures. At the gloomy edge of the Pacific Northwest forest, Jake Thompson cleared his throat. He waited until my father and I had stopped and stood directly across from him, then added, "But I have a team with thumbs firmly planted in their asses because there are fairy tale monsters roaming out here, so I have to play your stupid game." "Congratulations," my father said. "Mr. Thompson, I know you think I'm crazy or a fraud, probably both. But I'm telling you one last time, it's not too late to take a bath with the money you might lose and find another project." Our employer was a muscular man with an even complexion, dressed in a tracksuit and white sneakers. He wore a large Rolex that caught the moonlight every time he scratched his thick, useful neck. "Are you almost done?" "Yes, I am." "Good. Do you want to get paid tonight?" "That would be really nice." "Then shut your trap and do what I hired you for." "Fair enough," replied my father. He grabbed 2 flashlights from his backpack and threw one in my direction. I caught it, a lump already forming in my throat. A labyrinth of twisted, crooked trees lay before us, their skeletal branches clashing like swinging arms. I had never seen a wooden creature. I didn't yet know if I had the courage to face one. My biggest fear at the time was disappointing my old man. Father led us along natural clearings until after about a dozen steps into the forest interior, the foliage thinned out. Over his shoulder, he said, "So, tell me, Mr. Thompson, isn't Devil's Peak a National Heritage Site? I'm surprised you got permission to clear the land. Is that your way of solving the problem? Showing these tree beings that I have the right papers? I was just curious. You're not the first visitor to try and buy land cheaply." Our employer rolled his eyes. "Well, Klaus, the simple fact is that this new development will be the magnet that attracts opportunities. The managers are scared of environmental warriors whining on Facebook, sure, but they also know that everything I touch turns to gold. Didn't the conservation groups try to stop you?" "Of course they did. Luckily, I don't believe in no's." "Interesting. I could have sworn the judge said no to your appeal against the reclamation order. You had to give up, 19 apartments?" "These fraud allegations are as legitimate as your little wooden friends," hissed Jake, his voice bitter. As this outsider belittled our beliefs, I gritted my teeth. However, my father just laughed. The skeptic couldn't rattle him. Not my father, steadfast as an oak, tall and lanky with a shock of gray hair and a long, straight nose just like mine. He said, "If you don't believe this nonsense, why are you coming to ask me for help?" "Two things. First, I came to ask for help. And second, I'm not an idiot. I've seen this fraud before. You locals invent fairy tales and shout about cultural heritage," air quotes accompanied these words, "to blackmail the evil entrepreneur from the big city. Well, fair warning. If I don't see any supernatural crap tonight, you won't get a single cent from me. Sound reasonable?" "It does, but fair warning, I strongly advise against any wooden creature touching you." "Oh dear, I'll try." Mr. Thompson looked down from his nose at me. "Ethan, right? How old are you, Ethan?" "I'm 12, I said. 12, huh? And that's old enough to hunt ghosts?" "Ethan can take care of himself," replied my father. My face flushed with pride over the compliment. Besides, there are things he needs to learn. The path twisted 3 times, leading us through muddy grass, along a narrow brook, deeper and deeper into the darkness. From the endless blackness, I could hear the crunching of dry leaves and the snapping of rotting wood pieces. Above the canopy where we could see it, the moon drifted behind thick, billowing clouds and reappeared. My electrified nerves twitched at every call of a tiny animal, barely audible beneath the whispering trees swaying in the wind. "Well?" said Mr. Thompson after a minute of silence. "Well, what?" asked my father. "Isn't this the part where you tell me about the tree fairies?" "I thought you don't believe in such things." "I don't. But I'm not just going to have my team show up tomorrow and say you didn't do the right magical tap dance to cleanse the evil spirits. What do you actually know about them?" "I know they're stopping me from streaming this damn hole." Father ducked under a branch. "Is that all? They kill children who wander through the woods late at night, blah, blah, blah. It's your standard town." Before Mr. Thompson could finish the sentence, a mouse scurried out from under a fallen log. He squeaked, hopped from one foot to the other, did a little foxtrot, and tried to kick the tiny animal, which was much too fast. Without turning around, my father said, "Don't worry. I've seen braver men here who jump out of their skin with fear." Despite the built-up fear, I laughed. My father enjoyed that. A lot. Mr. Thompson mumbled something too quietly to hear. "Well, the kid is partly right," my father said on the other side of a fern garden. "What they're actually doing is—" His voice trailed off there. "You know what? It's too creepy. We don't want Ethan to run away without evidence, do we, Ethan? Stop downplaying it and tell the damn story." The beam of my father's flashlight swept in low arcs across the ground. "Ethan, do you want to take this over?" All around us, the trees closed in from every direction. As we struggled forward, our cheeks and arms were scraped by sharp branches. It felt like the forest was constantly reaching for us, touching us. Almost against my will, I admired their resemblance to twisted, elongated shapes. Next to the developer, I cleared my throat. The wooden creatures are like us, or, well, some are. Others, not so much. Do you know what a doppelganger is? No, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A doppelganger is... He's kidding, Ethan, my father said as he fought through more tangled underbrush. Behind him lay a sea of leaves, smothered in darkness. I said, "Oh? So there's a colony of wooden people out here living in wooden villages. They used to keep away from us, and we kept away from them. People didn't worry about them. Like hurricanes. If you live somewhere with lots of hurricanes, you'd probably think about them. But in Oregon, we never had a hurricane because it's not a warm tropical climate, so we don't worry about them. It was the same with the wooden creatures. It was hard to encounter them. But then we started building cities and railways and so on. That meant their homes were constantly being destroyed, so they began to move. But then we started building even more, so through a narrow gap, I saw movement and hesitated. A cold gust of air scattered dead leaves over my boots. Mr. Thompson said, "Let me guess. Soon they had so little space that they got angry and attacked." Well, no. At first, they tried to explain their problem. "Oh, so our wooden friends speak English. They're like those talking trees in Game of Thrones, right?" He walked and stood next to a nearby birch, pressed his mouth against a large hollow in its knobby trunk and said, "Hey, tree friend, are you awake? Can I clear this place?" The entrepreneur looked at us, grinned, his porcelain white teeth clearly visible against the darkness. "Well, what do you know?" He said it was completely okay. In the middle of a patch of dirt, mud, and weeds, my father said, "Quiet, you two." Branches scratched roughly against each other as the forest trembled in its various joints. "What is it, a fox?" asked Mr. Thompson. Father silenced him with a gesture. From somewhere invisible, whispers echoed. Or maybe it was just the wind. My trembling hand struggled to hold the flashlight steady. Again and again, I wiped the sweat from my jacket and prayed that my father didn't notice. Father turned to us. "Ethan, you stay here with Mr. Thompson. I will—" "Oh no," countered the cynic. "If I stay here, you go out, smoke a cigarette, and come back out of breath as if you just performed an exorcism." Unable to hide his excitement, my father exhaled through his nostrils. "You asked for my help. Now I'm giving it to you. Nobody is trying to scam you, I promise. You don't live as part of nature, so you don't see it. But Oregon bleeds magic. The world does. And now it's starting to fight back. If there are wooden people in this forest tonight, you'll leave this forest as a changed person, believe me. But now I need you to listen." It was strange to see my father angry. He was usually so calm. To me, he said, "Ethan, I'm going to lure them out now. Stay here and keep a candle burning in case they come this way." From my backpack, I grabbed an Olympic torch and lit it with a lighter from the side pocket. The thought that Father wasn't there to protect us made my blood run cold. If the wooden creatures attacked, it would be up to me to protect us. My father said, "Remember, Mr. Thompson, no matter what happens, don't let them touch you." This warning was met with an eye roll. With the flashlight in hand, my father disappeared behind a group of ash trees while I stood there, knees trembling. "The problem with you small-town folks," said Jake, as soon as the darkness fully swallowed my father. "All this superstition. This development could be a great opportunity, more tax revenue, more jobs. But instead, you run around and fear things that make noises at night. Those aren't superstitions," I snapped back, more energetically than intended. "And besides, even if they were, there are animals here too. Are we just going to destroy their homes so you can make money? Kid, do you see that?" He tapped his Rolex. "This baby cost $50,000. The BMW I arrived in was 3 times that. Your dad drives a hatchback older than you. I heard that junker sputters up the road 5 minutes before you showed up. Here's a free piece of advice. If you want to make something of your life, get your head out of the clouds." A black spot briefly filled the gaps between the trees at the corner of my eye. After getting irritated again, I said, "Money isn't everything. Sorry to burst your bubble, kid, but it is. Why else would your old man be out here? If he was really keen on protecting the forest, why would he take my money to perform this bogus cleansing?" I had no answer, so I turned around instead. Another cold gust of wind made me shiver. A moment later, I heard the rustling of dead leaves. I swallowed a weak, "Dad?" No answer. "Is this the part where you stage an attack?" Mr. Thompson asked, pretending to be bored. But did his voice tremble a bit? Branches moved as the forest took deep, trembling breaths. It sounded like whispering. My heart rate accelerated. It's a nice trick, I have to admit. Tom did a terrible job sounding uninterested. More whispering now behind us. I prayed silently that Father would come back and then turned my torch and flashlight around. Illuminated by the beam of light stood a massive, tumor-like oak tree. Behind it came the rapid sound of footsteps. I held the torch like a shield. "Who's there?" My companion hovered like a shadow over me, so close that his short, quick breaths blew down my neck. What happened to all his courage, barely visible with the light? The tree inhaled and exhaled. I stood completely still, weapon raised and trembling. "See?" stammered Mr. Thompson. "It's nothing. Just the wind." Before he could finish the sentence, a pair of eyes opened, cloudy and pale as if plagued by gray clouds. Pressed against the tree, a face looked back at us, like a mask of living bark, and smiled. Together, Mr. Thompson and I screamed. My hands slipped with the torch, which slid into a mud patch and went out with a wet splash. The forest broke into babbling and whispering. Behind us, ahead, on both sides. I threw the flashlight in one direction and then the other. Every time the beam hit a tree, another face appeared, each grinning like a group of Cheshire cats. In unison, figures stepped away from the trunks. From head to toe, they had the rough texture of bark, except for the pale eyes. Malevolent growths enveloped their skulls, branches and limbs sprouted from their shoulders and necks, and some were even covered with fuzzy moss. Limping with rough joints bent at strange angles, they trudged toward us. A screaming Mr. Thompson tore himself through a narrow gap in the underbrush. I ran after him, unable to think straight. Hip-high foliage pressed in on both sides of the path to our ankles. I followed the sturdy man through a maze of sticks and spears as he sprinted ahead, faster than my legs could carry me. Out of nowhere, he came to an abrupt stop. As I caught up, the terrified man stepped back from more wooden beings, too many to count. He turned on his heels, pushing me aside with his heels, only to discover Morse approaching behind us, cutting off every escape route. Jake sniffled weakly. "Please, leave me alone. I'll give you anything, money, jewelry." He removed his Rolex and offered it as a gift. "I'll never come here again, please, just..." Together, they stepped forward, limbs extended. They were now so close, so very close. As Jake stepped his foot into a bare root, he stumbled backward into the ground. All our tormentors stopped, except one that continued until it was close enough to stretch a limb against Jake's forehead. On hands and knees, it turned away, crawling over the tangled ground toward me. His face had already developed warts. No, not warts, suckers, buds. The flesh of his cheeks and forehead bubbled, swelling rapidly in sections, while dark spots spread ever darker on his neck, his forearms, his eyes, and even his lips. paralyzed with fear, I could only watch. Tears streamed down the sleeves of his tracksuit, running over his shoulders, chest, and waistband. In seconds, Jake's limbs swelled and elongated. His clothing fell to the ground in torn ruins. Naked and disfigured, he stumbled to his feet and lumbered toward me, his screams fading, his limbs stiff and awkward. Roots sprouted from his feet and gripped the ground, biting deep, destroying any hope of moving forward. Through immovable lips, he stammered, "Help me, please." In his mouth, I saw a thick green carpet. Within seconds, the man was no longer distinguishable from a small oak tree, a branch stretching forward forever, the limb lying just a few centimeters from my neck. What snapped me out of my trance was the sound of vomiting. Behind the tree that was once Jake, the wooden creature gagged up splinters and moss. Its bark peeled away, revealing beige skin underneath. At the end of a limb, a fist opened and closed, tearing chunks of wood from a skull. Beneath these sections lay human features, nose, ears, lips. The man bent over, screamed, and gasped for air, like a chick hatching from its egg. I was so mesmerized by this disgusting sight that I didn't notice the other wooden beings surrounding us. After 6 frozen backward steps, a low branch, thicker than an amputated forearm, stabbed into the lower back area. I turned around, my heart fighting against my chest, only to discover that I had crashed into the nearest wooden person. I fell to the ground, my head buried in my lap. "Please," I whimpered. "I don't want to be one of you, please." Even then, my thoughts were with my father and what he might have thought when he saw his son lying there so frightened. A silence settled over the forest. I took several short, trembling breaths. That meant my lungs weren't solid yet. Not yet. Slowly, I looked up. Woody figures loomed above me, motionless. The nearest one pulled its limb back. "Let me through." My father's voice rang out from the crowd. "Dad?" I called. Figures stepped aside, clearing a path through which he walked. "Ethan." I stood up, ran forward, and threw myself into his arms, my cheeks wet with tears. I dropped the torch. "I'm sorry, I'm so... Shh, it's okay." He placed a warm hand on my shoulder and my nerves calmed down. "But Mr. Thompson, he's completely fine." Father stepped aside. Behind his shoulder, a new Mr. Thompson donned a replacement outfit from my father's backpack. A dry gulp paralyzed my throat. "We need to run. We need to... It's okay, we're not in any danger." He pulled me close to him. "You see, my son, there's something you need to know about us. How I know so much about this place. You and I, Ethan, we were among the first. Years ago, before you were old enough to even remember, our people realized that we needed a way to protect ourselves. So I volunteered to talk to the humans. But they didn't want to listen, so now we resist, against those who want to destroy our home. We are wooden people. We sinned. We are wooden people?" Father squeezed my hand. "But what'll happen to Mr. Thompson?" "But what happens to Mr. Thompson?" He gestured to the tree that was once the real estate mogul. Every wanderer who stumbled upon it might have made a casual remark about the vague human shape, the distorted part of the branches, vaguely shaped like a screaming face, forever etched in terror. You could practically hear the silent scream. Jake Thompson, the new Jake Thompson, lifted the discarded Rolex from the mud and brushed it clean. He gave me a small smile and then slipped the watch onto his wrist. I squeezed my father's hand even tighter. "But couldn't we have helped him? We could have explained." He shook his head. "If we turn 100 Jake Thompsons, 100 more would just appear. We have to replace them, my son, all of them, the humans. Like I said, Oregon bleeds magic, and these flesh sacks never learn. So we take over. Not just here, but everywhere. England, Germany, Spain, America. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with me. "Are you ready, my son? Will you help us protect this world?" I wiped the tears from my eyes, a new hardness in my stomach. "I will, Dad. I will." For me, it started in a stuffy room where I watched an old man's chest rise and fall more and more slowly until it finally stopped altogether. It's important to me that you know about him. He wasn't just another case. He wasn't patient zero. He was a man I really liked and who enriched the lives of many. His name was Harold. He loved children, even though he didn't have any of his own. He used to be a children's entertainer. He performed puppet shows and magic tricks that delighted his young audience. He was a kind man with a great sense of humor. He enjoyed crossword puzzles and wordplay, really bad puns. I always joked with him that he should have been a father because he mastered the art of the dad joke. He spent his last days at Sunset Pines Assisted Living, where I worked. He died twice there. I'll tell you about both. The first time, Harold died peacefully. He had been in poor health for some time, and although he was still active in his 80s, he had difficulty walking in the weeks leading up to his death. We had to use a wheelchair for short distances. He hated it. He hated relying on us, waiting for one of us to take care of him and help him into the wheelchair when he used to be able to walk to the dining hall alone. He used to enjoy walking around the facility, and when I had time, I'd take him outside for fresh air. He also loved birds and would show them to me during our walks. In the last days of his life, he was bedridden and largely absent. He faded in and out, mumbling nonsense when he could speak at all. Small fragments of his life replayed in recovered memories, irrelevant to what was happening to him in reality. From what I could gather as I heard him murmur, he had a happy life, and I was glad he could relive it in his final days instead of being trapped in the reality of his frail body and the small room he was confined in. I was with him when he died. People who work in assisted living facilities have a sixth sense for when someone is about to pass, and even though my shift ended at 2 p.m., I volunteered to sit with him. He had family, but they all lived too far away, and I didn't want Harold to die alone. I took a chair near his bed and sat there, listening to the traffic outside his window and the sounds of the facility behind his locked door. One of the cleaning staff, Karen, was singing in the hallway nearby, and the afternoon shift was busy sorting laundry and running errands. Harold and I were suspended in a sleepy, morbid bubble, while life around us continued with all its noise and mild drama. Harold's breathing was labored, and every time he drew air into his lungs, the effort forced me to tighten. He sounded lively and hoarse, a man drowning in his own mortal body, and I wished for his own sake that he would give up the fight. I drifted off, almost asleep. The room was warm, and I'd gotten up early. I was in a half-dream where Harold was walking with me around the grounds and pointed to a magpie sitting on the fence. "A sign of bad luck," he said to me, and I laughed. It was just a superstition. But he turned to me with a sad face and shook his head. The magpie then cawed, sounding more like a crow than a magpie, a scratchy noise that snapped me out of my drowsiness. Upon waking, I realized it wasn't the bird cawing, but Harold's breathing making such a horrible sound, the dying breath. I had heard it before, but the ugly sound always scared me. It disturbed me even more because one of my favorite residents was making it. I watched as his chest rose again, painfully expanding and then falling with a long, drawn-out cough. I waited. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Harold was gone. I had witnessed too many deaths in this place to get sentimental. In a few days, his room would be cleared of his personal belongings, sanitized, and ready for a new resident. But I paused to pay my respects to a dear man. It's strange to be in a room with a dead body. It's like the exact opposite of the feeling described in paranormal TV shows when you feel like you're being watched, but no one is there. You're there in a physical form, clearly visible, but the spirit is gone, and despite their presence, the room is empty except for you. I must emphasize that after everything that happened afterward, I didn't feel Harold's presence at all. After gathering my thoughts, I left the room and went to find one of the caregivers, Susan. The morning shift had 4 caregivers and 2 registered nurses, while the afternoon shift only had 3 caregivers and 1 registered nurse. It was my bad luck that on that afternoon, a male caregiver named Tom was in charge. Tom and I never got along well. He was a caregiver but took evening courses in business law, and I always felt like he didn't really like the people he was paid to care for. He was cold, with little compassion to give, and worse, he was lazy. As expected, I found him still in the office. His feet were resting on a chair, and he was drinking coffee while reading the local newspaper. He looked up as I entered, apparently surprised I was still there, but he neither moved his feet nor put down his newspaper. "Harold has died," I said to him. "You better call his relatives." That made him move. He sighed as if Harold's death was the most inconvenient thing ever, and set both his cup and the newspaper down. "Okay," he said, "I'll take care of it." I went to the break room to change from my uniform into casual clothes. I was sad, but you learn to cope with sadness when you work with people who don't have long to live. I wondered who would take Harold's place in his room and whether they would be nice or not when Tom called me from the hallway. He stood outside Harold's room, hands on his hips, his face showing displeasure. "Trying to be funny, or are you just incompetent?" he said as he saw me coming while I stuck my head around the door. "What do you mean?" Tom didn't answer but gestured impatiently and disappeared back into Harold's room. I put on my boots and went over to him. Tom's shoulders blocked my view of Harold's bed, and I nudged him aside with my elbow. I couldn't imagine what Tom was trying to scold me for. I had done everything by the book, and fiddling with the body was beyond my responsibility. But when I saw what was lying in the bed, I gasped. Harold's eyes were open, and that alone I could have overlooked, but I couldn't ignore that he was moving. His arms twitched, small, jerky movements that somehow reminded me of experiments where frog legs were stimulated with electricity. And if that wasn't enough, his head moved from side to side in tiny, negative gestures, as if he was shaking off the idea of being dead and denying everything. His glassy eyes flashed as I gasped, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a gruesome attempt to smile. His gums were blue and receded, making his teeth look too large for his mouth. "Hello," he croaked, his voice sounding thick and wet, somehow as if it came from far away. "Dead, huh?" said Tom. "Looks pretty alive to me." He stared at me. I felt the pressure of his gaze and the reproach in it. But at that moment, I didn't care about his opinion. I should have been happy with my fallibility, I think. I should have been glad that my friend Harold was still with us. But I couldn't be happy. He was dead, you see. I didn't doubt it. He was dead, and no matter where you stand on religion and the purpose of the soul, I was in this room with an empty shell before I could go to Tom. There was no escape. Harold struggled, and it seemed like he wanted to sit up. He hadn't been able to sit without help for at least a week, maybe 2, but he was trying. Seeing him move made me uncomfortable on a level I couldn't quite identify. It was like watching a stop-motion animation that was poorly executed, with gaps in the animation, and his twitches seemed way too slow. "Give me a hand," Tom said, unimpressed, and sat down on Harold's right side, hooking his wrist under Harold's armpit and leaning back. I knew what Tom wanted from me. It was a simple task I'd performed countless times. A simple lifting of a resident into a sitting position, but I couldn't do it. It would mean touching Harold, and suddenly the idea of touching him was disgusting. I pulled back, hesitated to make any contact, and Tom clicked his tongue over my shoulder. "Come on." Despite my hesitation, my feet moved instinctively. I was a good employee, conscientious and always ready to help. I didn't care which company paid my wages, but the people I cared for mattered to me. And if someone asked me to help one of them, I always helped. I went to Harold's left side. I knew what I had to do, had done it countless times, but this time I hesitated. I didn't want to touch him. Once, a friend, Laura, offered to install a new antenna on my TV, and I was asked to stick my hand into a wall cavity to pass the cable through. I did it, blindly reaching into the dark, dusty, cobweb-covered space, and my hand touched not the cable, but the dried remains of a bird. It was dry and long dead, but after touching it, I washed my hands countless times to get rid of the feeling of that dry little corpse in my hand. Standing next to Harold's bed, I had the same feeling of disgust when asked to touch him. I knew it would be gross, and that I could never get rid of this feeling. I forced myself to get a grip on myself and him. His skin was cool and damp, and my fingers sank way too easily into the soft flesh of his upper arm. I could imagine my hands leaving an imprint in that unpleasant texture forever. Tom began to count. On 3, and just as I was preparing to help the old man sit up, Harold turned his head to me. "Hope you feel strong," he croaked. "I'm a dead weight." He let an eyelid drop in a wink that took too long and coughed from laughing. The exchange gave me an icy shiver that crawled down my chest and into my stomach. It was a joke. I knew it was a joke. Harold loved to joke. But this particular pun, then delivered, I hated it. Along with the wink, which Tom hadn't noticed, it had a whole different tone than Harold's usual cheerful banter. That wink sealed it for me, indicating there was something he was only sharing with me, and part of him liked that I felt uncomfortable. I still helped him sit up, supported him with pillows. I sought refuge in my efficiency and turned off my mind. Harold seemed heavier than usual, although his illness had worn out his body in the past weeks, but I decided it was my imagination. "Want something, Harold?" Tom asked. "Maybe a nice cup of tea?" "Oh, yes," Harold said. "I'm dying for a cup of tea." "Okay, we'll get it for you. Brenda will bring it, right, Brenda?" He was already leaving the room, convinced I would act immediately, and the thought of having to be alone in the room with Harold made me panic. I followed closely behind Tom, and as I reached the hallway, I noticed something wonderful. My shift had ended hours ago. I didn't have to do anything else but go home. "Sorry, Tom," I said, knowing I didn't sound apologetic at all. "I'm off duty. Maybe you should bring Harold his tea." Before he could respond, I ducked into the locker room, grabbed my bag, and was out the front door as his protests echoed behind me. I showered when I got home. I turned the heater up until the water was boiling hot. I felt dirty, infected almost, and even though I washed until my skin was red, I still felt dirty, as if my contact with Harold had laid a rotten, invisible film over me. After I ate, watched TV, and read a bit, I felt better. If Tom were to suggest I overreacted, I would have given him hell, but admitting it to myself wasn't so hard. I was wrong. Nothing more, nothing less. I had seen some deaths in my time, but I wasn't an expert. Everyone was different, and I shouldn't give such feelings too much weight. Harold wasn't dead. I was wrong. I was unfortunately very sure of that. I went to bed and felt much safer and calmer. The belief that Harold had died had obviously colored my feelings toward him, and that wasn't fair. I had the next day off, and when I returned to work, I would treat him as I always had, without prejudice. Everything was fine. That night, I had a terrible dream. I dreamt I was drunk and caught the wrong bus, and instead of going home, I found myself at work in the early hours, my makeup smeared and my head spinning. It seemed logical in the dream that instead of calling a taxi, I went to work and asked if I could stay there. The night shift staff let me in. They said there was a bed where I could sleep, but it was difficult, and I had to promise to stay quiet. I didn't care. I was tired and drunk. They took me to a room, not Harold's, but another one that shouldn't have been there, in a part of the building that didn't exist. Elsie died today, they told me. You can have her bed. We didn't have anyone named Elsie in our facility, but I didn't ask questions. I also didn't notice that Elsie's body hadn't been removed. She was a figure under a sheet, face and body covered, but I was too tired to notice. I lay at the foot of her bed like a dog, trying to sleep. I couldn't sleep well, although Elsie's body twitched and jerked constantly, her feet drumming an irregular rhythm against me. I wanted to get up and report to the night staff that they had made a mistake, that Elsie wasn't dead, but at the same time I knew she was, and I would just have to endure it if I wanted a place to stay. Just before I woke up, the figure under the sheet began to rise, as if this unknown Elsie was sitting up, and I watched in detached horror, knowing I should be afraid of what was happening, but ultimately more afraid of making a fuss and seeming ungrateful. I woke up with a jolt. My bedroom was still dark, and I caught myself feeling for the blankets to make sure I was in my own bed and not one already occupied by a corpse. My bed was empty except for me, and even though I knew it was just a dream, I had to turn on my nightstand lamp and read for a while before I could fall asleep again. I went back to work exhausted. I hadn't slept well since Harold's death. He hadn't visited any of my dreams, but I had still experienced many disturbing things when I should have been resting. I hoped that after talking to him and seeing him normally, I would get all that nonsense out of my system. Despite my determination to face my fears, I was nervous as I sat down in the office to do the handover. The night nurse, Karen, briefed us all on what had happened the past night before Helen, the head nurse of the morning shift, began assigning us to the residents. Mabel was congested. Rita was confused. Dennis looked pale, the usual stuff. However, Harold. He had wandered around at night and surprised the night staff with his sudden mobility. Although they had urged him to go to bed, he had refused, saying he would sleep when he was dead. That was uncharacteristic of Harold. He loved to sleep and often went to bed early. He also smelled bad, apparently, and I sighed inwardly about it. Most likely, he would need a bath, and I had no doubt I would be assigned to it. Surely, Harold was on my short list of residents to care for in the morning, and he needed a bath. I didn't want to do it. For a moment, I considered faking an illness and taking one of my precious sick days to avoid what I had to do. But I knew it would ultimately be pointless. I would have to come back eventually, and the sooner I encountered Harold and reminded myself that I was being foolish, the sooner I could get back to normal. Despite my resolve, I first took care of my other assigned residents. Doris and Nellie were semi-independent and didn't need much help washing and dressing, so I was free once I had escorted them to the dining hall to take care of Harold. He was sitting in his room, his chair tilted towards the door instead of the window. He had always liked watching the birds outside, the bird bath and a feeding table where he could see them. But now he seemed to prefer watching people inside. Immediately, I could see what they were talking about. The smell was strong and unpleasant, sweet and yeasty like moldy bread. He didn't smile when he saw me. A corner of his mouth twitched as if his muscle memory was trying to smile, but that was all. I smiled anyway and put on my sunniest face, trying to suppress the renewed feeling of disgust. "Good morning, Harold. I hear you were out and about. You'll wear yourself out." He then smiled, something more like a grin. "Can't stop me, can you?" His voice sounded earthy and moist, somehow as if it was buried and left to rot. I suppressed a shiver and shook my head mentally. Stupid thought. He was just an old man recovering from a severe illness. "I was told you need a bath, Harold," I continued. "Do you want one?" I hoped he would say no and let me go without feeling guilty, but he nodded, that sly grin getting wider. His lips were dry, and the thin skin on them tore as they stretched. I had always helped Harold undress when he needed it, but back then it was different. He had cooperated, shaking his shoulders out of his shirt, leaning in to give me access, and he had maintained a stream of chatter that made a potentially uncomfortable, intimate task much more comfortable. Now, however, he didn't. This new Harold sat like a lump of flesh, watching me with unsettling concentration as I unbuttoned his shirt and opened his zipper. His breath touched my face several times as I had to get closer. It might have been my overactive imagination, but it felt cold instead of warm. However, the smell was no imagination, a stale, fleshy stench that made me gag. I held my breath whenever I could. There was also no talking. Normally, when I was with an unresponsive resident, I would fill the silence with small talk about the weather and reports on the progress of the bath. But today, I let the dripping faucet and the splashing water take over this task, along with the groaning and whistling of air entering and leaving his mouth. He breathed heavily and slowly, as if constantly reminded to do so. Only when drying him did he finally speak. "Where were you?" he asked. "I had my day off, Harold," I said to him, while drying the sparse fuzz of his hair. "Can't work 7 days a week, you know. I really need a break." He looked at me, sunken eyes contemplating my response. "I didn't mean yesterday," he finally said. "I meant the other time, when I woke up." I had to suppress a shiver. Woke up. "Why did you leave me?" he insisted. In his eyes flickered an unpleasant little glimmer that I didn't like at all. I felt it was a trick question. "I went out and left a dying man," I said. "Not like you, Brenda. Must have a reason. What was it?" He was teasing me, he knew very well. He just wanted me to say it out loud, but I wasn't ready to do it yet. Whatever he was now, he was no longer Harold to me. The mean little grin on his face confirmed that for me. I looked into his eyes. Dead in the eyes, so to speak. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. "I went to the bathroom, Harold," I said. "Can't ignore it when nature calls." He laughed then, coughing the sound out in a series of choked twitches, and I wished he would choke on his amusement. I forced a fake smile onto my face. "Time for breakfast," I said. "Do you want to go for a walk, or should I get you a chair?" He then waved his hand and wiped my question away with disgust clearly on his face. "I'm going," he said. "Forget your chair." That might seem like a small detail, but it's significant. Harold never used swear words. He always believed such words were beneath him. I don't disapprove of the word shit. On the contrary, I use it all the time, but never around the residents. And I rarely heard it from any of them, so it was shocking to hear Harold say it after years of care. There was another resident, John, who had suffered a stroke during our care. He had been very gentle and polite before the stroke, but afterward, we learned that not only had it made his entire right side weak and useless, but it had also stolen every other word in his vocabulary that wasn't offensive. Saying "good morning" to John would be met with "fuck off," in a tone that clearly indicated he actually wanted to wish you a good morning. Maybe Harold had suffered a stroke. It was something I could have believed if it weren't for the fact that he was more mobile than ever before since I had known him, and that made no sense at all. There were no excuses. Something strange had happened to Harold, and it wasn't my imagination. The dining hall was a potential war zone when it came to seating. Many of the residents had gotten used to the seating arrangements and didn't allow changes, but Harold didn't care. I tried to guide him to an almost empty table near a window, but he ignored my pleading and sat near the kitchen. There was an unspoken hierarchy among the residents, and the table normally occupied by Rose, Anna, and Maria would likely be considered the prime table. So, when Harold got an extra chair to sit with them, they looked at him with polite disbelief. He showed them his teeth in what could have been a smile, and declined offers of porridge and cereal. He just wanted meat. We served him sausages and bacon, and he pushed his fork aside to eat his meal with his hands. Rose turned her head away with cultivated displeasure, and he laughed as he devoured his breakfast, licking his fingers and spilling food scraps onto the tablecloth. Maria stood up and left the room. She was quite mobile and reached a pretty nimble speed as she hopped away with her walker, her shoulder posture making her displeasure very clear. Rose followed closely behind, leaning on her cane and mumbling something about manners. Only Anna stayed behind, looking at her new breakfast partner with horrified fascination and pulling back as he gave a big, liquid belch. Harold grinned at her. Bacon bits hung between his teeth and fat on his chin. "Your friends don't have a stomach for me," he said in his new, clearing voice while pulling at his teeth with his thumb. "Too bad, we could have had fun." He then let another slow wink drop and leaned over the table. He said something else to Anna, something I won't repeat out of respect for her, but it was delivered in an exaggerated stage whisper that was heard throughout the dining hall, even over the muted chatter and clinking cutlery. Anna went pale, clinging to the collar of her blouse, and the room fell into shocked silence. I knew I should say something. What Harold suggested to Anna was unacceptable, but I was speechless. There weren't many male residents in the home, and the only other one present that day was Dennis. I heard his chair scrape as he stood up and turned around. Dennis was shaking with anger, a butter knife in hand. "Make him apologize," he said, swinging the dull knife towards Harold. "You don't say such things to a lady." Harold laughed, thumping the table as if it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, but his face wasn't laughing, even though his mouth was. His eyes were fixed on Dennis, and I didn't like the way he was looking at me. I moved my feet and positioned myself between them to block their line of sight. Anna whispered softly as another caregiver escorted her out of the room. Harold stopped laughing. The sound cut off as if a door to a soundproof room had been slammed shut, and he stared at me. "You're going too far, Harold," I said. His lip curled into a mocking pout, but he didn't respond. He simply stood up and walked stiffly away. I made sure everyone else had seated themselves and that the other caregivers had everything under control, then went to find the head nurse, Helen. She deserved more than I did. She could handle it. While I didn't tell Helen the full range of my suspicions about Harold, she at least took me seriously when I explained all his new, unpleasant traits. Helen had been a nurse when I started working at the assisted living facility, and I had seen her rise to junior and then senior nurse, so she knew me well enough to know I wasn't overreacting. "A stroke? That's possible," she said, after I told her my version of events. It was a version I had carefully crafted, and in appearance, I had managed not to come across as completely crazy. "Tom recently said something about you making a mistake." I took it with a grain of salt, obviously. Lazy bastard probably just didn't want to make observations. She grabbed her stethoscope and reached for the blood pressure cuff from her desk drawer. "You're starting to pull residents from the tables and clean up. I'll take care of Harold." A sense of relief washed over me as she left the office. It was the same feeling you get as a child when an adult takes over a difficult situation you don't want to deal with. I focused on the normal rhythm of the morning routine. The three women who had sat with Harold in the morning had gone back to their rooms, while Dennis, still pale with outrage, took a few laps to check on the remaining residents who had witnessed the drama and ensure they were okay. I accompanied Lily to her usual spot when Helen called me from the door of the common room and beckoned me over with a nod of her head before she disappeared around the corner toward the office. As soon as Lily sat down, I went to see what she had to say. Helen was very quiet as I entered the room. She pushed a chair towards me with her foot but didn't look me in the eye as she placed the blood pressure cuff back into her desk drawer. "Well?" I asked, sitting down. "Pulse normal, blood pressure normal." I didn't do anything profound, just the usual observations, not much more that I could do with what I have. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled some air. A part of me, a small but very energetic part, had honestly expected her to panic and tell me Harold had no pulse, but I sensed there was more to it. Helen seemed very thoughtful. She was looking out the window. "Both normal," she said again. But it felt like it was only sometimes normal. She then looked at me. A shy little side glance I never expected from Helen. "I can't explain it," she admitted. "But I can see what you mean. He's not okay. And not just medically not okay." She laughed, turned back to some papers on her desk and shuffled them back and forth. "Jesus, remember when all the ladies in the East Wing kept complaining that children were walking around at night, and when the night staff checked, no one was there? I thought that would be the weirdest thing I'd have to deal with. Ghost children I can handle. But what's going on?" I asked. "What's bothering you so much if his observations are normal?" She shrugged. "I don't know, Bren," she said. "Just a feeling. His pulse was okay, but I noticed it was fluctuating. Couldn't figure out why. I could have understood if it sped up when he was excited or something, but it did the opposite. I noticed it slowed down. Significantly slower. And not when he was excited, it was when he was distracted. I started talking to him, asking him questions that really made him think, and whenever he was deep in thought, his pulse slowed down so much it almost stopped. The same happened with his blood pressure." She took a deep breath, trembling. "Don't tell anyone. This isn't a professional opinion, it's just a gut feeling." But it was almost like he forgot to let his heart keep beating while talking. Our gazes met. I could see Helen was dead serious. "Don't say a word," she said. "It's nonsense and I'm stupid." But still, it gave me chills. Harold gives me chills. The relief of being able to share this with someone was still there, but at the same time, a new fear was introduced. I had hoped Helen would declare I was just stressed, that I needed a good night's sleep and a few days off. But here she confirmed my own concerns. It wasn't just me, and somehow that made everything worse. Summary of the next days and weeks. Harold's condition continued to deteriorate, but it was a slow process. His smell got worse. It reached the point where no one could stand being near him, but that was okay because he couldn't stand having anyone near him anyway. While he was still aggressively mobile, his coordination worsened, and he often stumbled. Sometimes he fell but didn't allow anyone to help him up, so we had to keep a cautious distance and watch him fumble on the floor until he was upright again. His speech began to fail him. He forgot words and replaced them more often with offensive phrases, becoming angrier each day when we couldn't understand him properly. But the most subtle was the gradual change in his overall appearance. Harold had always liked to dress well, but his clothes, possibly due to contact with his body, began to rot. The armpits of his shirts, the crotch areas of his pants. They started to decompose despite frequent washing. It was as if they were infected by his strange, special illness. His posture also changed, curving and bending forward as his muscles and tendons atrophied. They pulled him into a semi-bent position that tightened each day, letting him peek through his overgrown eyebrows as he trudged his relentless, uneven path through the hallways. And he wandered all the time. If you believe the night staff, and I did, to some extent, he never slept. It was easy to imagine how this new and improved version of Harold feverishly patrolled the corridors, dragging himself through the dim lights while everyone else slept. He also started grinding his teeth. I didn't know if it was conscious or unconscious, but it was very unsettling. It got to the point where you could hear him coming before you heard his shrouded feet, although he could sometimes be quiet. To my own horror, I noticed this. One day, I sniffed around the laundry room at the end of a hallway. We stored linens there, and no one particularly liked it since it was a known ecosystem for oversized spiders. But that day, I had to go in to find spare sheets for a resident who had an accident after a vivid nightmare. The residents liked their linens matching, and I was busy finding a bottom sheet that matched the flowers on my resident's duvet cover when I felt a tickling sensation on the inside of my knee. It wasn't an isolated feeling that I could attribute to random itchiness. It pulled a small, stuttering rhythm against my knee before it started crawling up the inside of my thigh, and I squealed as I dropped the sheet I was holding and kicked my leg out. But it wasn't a spider, as I had thought. It was much worse. I turned around and saw Harold standing behind me, just pulling his hand back, giggling with delight at the effect he had. His fingers were still outstretched, playing in the air, two of them slyly curling upward in an inviting gesture. And for the first time in my career, I felt my right hand clench into a fist. I really wanted to hit him. I was disgusted and angry, could still feel the faint trace of his fingertips on my skin, and I remembered thinking how easy it would be to just break his fragile old bones for what he had done. It hadn't been foolishness. If I hadn't stopped him, he could have continued. He would have made a serious attack. He withdrew, moving backward in his now usual hunched gait, and I let my fingers relax. Repulsed as I was, I still had my job to do. I kept my eyes on Harold until he was out of sight, picked up the sheet I had dropped, changed my resident's bed, and then went to the office to file a report. It got worse. The night staff seemed regularly nervous and desperate when we came in for the morning shift, all because of Harold. One morning, I walked in and found the night nurse, Karen, in a deep, whispered conversation with Helen, and the shared glances on their faces didn't stop me from changing before I went to the office. Helen recognized my entry with a nod, let Beatrice continue speaking, and included me. Harold had disappeared that night, it seemed. They had become quite accustomed to him being constantly on the move, but he was rarely gone. He liked hiding behind corners and in closets and jumping out to scare them, but he always reappeared in one way or another. The previous night, however, was different. They had searched high and low, cautiously aware of his new love for jump scares, but he wasn't in any of his usual hiding spots. They were about to report him missing, something they didn't want to do because of all the hassle and investigations it would cause when someone finally found him. We had a resident named Joanne. She was in the advanced stages of dementia, so far advanced that she barely perceived anything outside the confines of her mind. Someone had once dropped a stack of plates right beside her, and she hadn't even flinched. She was mobile when assisted, although her body was curved into a crescent shape, almost like Harold's, and she had no will to move unless someone held her. She was also completely incontinent. However, she did speak, and it was almost constant when she was awake. It wasn't always possible to understand her words, but her voice rose and fell with intonation, making it likely she was reliving past conversations. We made her as comfortable as possible on a daily basis, trying to provide stimulation, but essentially she was completely isolated from everyone around her, trapped in her own head. Except on the last night. A member of the night staff, Beatrice, had heard Joanne speaking as usual at night, but it wasn't her normal, steady talking. It was high-pitched and much louder, barking a single syllable repeatedly. No, no, no! Exclamation mark. It was such a strange difference for Joanne that Beatrice went to investigate. She found Harold there, illuminated by the slit of light coming through the open door. He was on the bed, hunched over Joanne in the shadows like a sleep paralysis demon. He had managed to pull up her nightgown and was about to remove her adult diaper when she burst. Beatrice had called for help, but not before grabbing the back of Harold's shirt, using the collar edge as a lever, and pulling him away from the helpless old woman. He had hunched down in resistance, she said. Growling and scratching and snapping his teeth, he called her by every name under the sun and some that had never seen the light of day. The other two members of the shift, Stephen and Lena, had stormed in, and he had made a wild strike at the youngest woman, Debbie, hitting her jaw and pulling her head back. She had fallen to the ground, and in all the commotion, Harold had taken his chance to escape. They found him later in his room, sitting in his chair, the overhead light off. He faced the door and sat still and quiet, his silhouette the only thing visible in the dim light coming through the window. Beatrice said she had planned to go in and talk to him, to scold him because he had hit Debbie and because she was sure he was about to do something to Joanne, but she said she couldn't bring herself to cross the threshold into his room. He felt angry, she said, shuddering at the memory. Pure anger. I couldn't even reach in and turn on the light, so I just closed the door and left him there. There were no locks on the outside of the residence room, so she couldn't secure him. But she did the only thing she could. She stacked chairs, buckets, and canes in front of his door, so that if he opened the door, the clattering would alert them. Until now, she said, he had stayed there. But she didn't know how long it would take for him to decide to come out again. The night shift went home and left us alone with Harold. Helen had filed a full report, but it wasn't enough. I need to go see Rita, she said, looking like she really didn't want to. Rita was the home director. Before Rita, we had Ruth, an actual nursing director with decades of care experience, but now that she had retired, Rita was all we had. She had never been a nurse. She was a businesswoman, and the only reason she seemed to be there was to figure out how we could make more money. Bert needs to go to security, Helen said. At least, but I'll recommend that he be removed from this place entirely. We aren't paid enough for it. Why not? I was horrified at the thought that Bert would stay with us. Money, Helen said in a flat tone. What else? You know she doesn't care about her staff or her residents aside from the money they bring. But don't worry, I won't leave it at that. She then smiled. It was a dark little smile, tightly curled lips, and unsettling, but I liked seeing it. Helen had always been on our side. I'll inform Joanne's relatives about what's happening. If Rita doesn't listen to me, they'll listen. As Harold left the table to go for a walk, no one stopped him. As Anna followed him, she swayed at his heels like a malnourished little dog, opposing no one. Except Rose. Rose and Anna had been friends for decades. Even before they both ended up here, they knew each other. They had even worked together at the old tobacco factory that stood on this site before the assisted living facility was built. So when Rose saw her old friend sluggishly follow the rude man, she naturally said something. I tried to intervene, but although Rose was lovable, she was also stubborn. She politely pushed me aside and hurried after the unlikely pair. "Anna! Anna!" Her voice sounded high and brittle against the backdrop of clattering plates and the TV in the common room flickering on. "Where are you going? Come back, honey." Anna barely glanced at her, turned the corner with Harold. It wasn't the direction her room went, so I followed. "Anna, don't go with this man. He's—" Rose's voice faded as she disappeared from sight, and I sprinted, transitioning from a standstill to a full run. What I saw as I caught up will haunt me. It's nothing one could ever expect to see. Anna stood aside, leaning her back against the wall, eyes lowered to watch the activity on the floor below. She smiled, a crooked grin that only lifted one side of her round face, the other side drooping and useless. Rose lay on the floor, turning her face, her dress rolled up around her hips, her old, loose underwear and support stockings visible, hands flailing against the flat pile of the functional carpet installed everywhere. And Harold knelt over her, his own clawed hands anchored at the lower end of her head, holding her tight as he opened his mouth impossibly wide. It's hard to describe what happened and how he looked, but I'll do my best. The short version is that Harold tried to tear the top of Rose's head off. The longer version requires a bit more imagination. Harold's mouth physically shouldn't have been able to open that wide, but he did. It was as if he had unlocked his jaw like a snake. His face stretched and distorted through the opening of his mouth. The skin so tight I was shocked it didn't tear. His eyes narrowed to long slits that didn't look human. The best comparison I can think of is combining Adam and Barbara from Beetlejuice when they were in their creepy forms and merging them. I screamed for Helen then, frozen in place. Harold's mouth was absolutely wide enough to grab Rose's head. It shouldn't have been possible, and I couldn't do anything to stop him. The mere thought of placing my hands on him now was abhorrent. Helen must have heard the pure panic in my voice and was beside me within seconds, not hesitating to act as soon as she took in the scene. She screamed for more backup while I stood there, useless and dumb, watching everything unfold in slow motion. Helen struggled with Harold, pushing him back and away from Rose. Harold didn't want to give up his prize, and he pulled Rose's emaciated hair with him. I saw the gray strands between his fingers as Helen overpowered him. Harold didn't go quietly. Until now, he had retained the most basic form of humanity, outwardly. But now it was all gone. He was wild and feral. The sound coming from his throat was both a high-pitched squeal and a deep growl at the same time. It took Helen and 2 more caregivers to subdue the old man. 3 healthy women holding him firmly while he thrashed and cursed and spat. I finally managed to move. I helped the poor Rose up, soothing her with meaningless words, and led her to her room to recover, while the fight in the hallway continued unabated. She was mostly unharmed, aside from missing hair and a few friction burns from her struggles. The biggest damage was emotional. So I stayed with her. A useful thing to do. Anything except getting involved in what was happening outside. Eventually, Anna, obviously bored with the drama, walked past Rose's room. She lingered long enough to look at Rose with absent impatience and favored me with another inappropriate, crooked grin. Whatever had happened to Anna, a stroke was definitely the beginning. I left Rose and tried to regulate the routine. It was hard work. Residents and staff alike were disturbed, and I tried to answer as many questions as possible as reassuringly as I could. At one point, I noticed the distinctive black van of the local funeral home in the parking lot near the entrance door of another unit. There were many units on site, each under the control of the same company but operated separately. We were used to seeing this van. It had discrete golden crosses on each side with the words "Private Ambulance" below. I was just taking a break, so I sat with a cup of tea by the window and watched as the funeral directors came out of the building and pushed a van that seemed empty. Strange. I opened the window slightly and leaned forward to listen. I couldn't hear much, although they were close, but the only words I could make out were "waste of time." I could have wondered why they were called, only to leave empty-handed. But all in all, I didn't ask too much. I went home after my shift. The janitor had come and installed a lock on Harold's door, and Harold was locked up. It seemed unethical, and under other circumstances I would have questioned it, but I wasn't in a position to complain. I was glad. And as I said, everything was blurry. I remember going home. I remember going straight to bed, even though it was only 3 p.m. I almost fell asleep immediately, drifting into the normal human sounds of traffic and children coming home from school, while I lay in the gray light. I'm almost sure that what I remember happening next was real. About 95% sure it wasn't a dream. I slept about 14 hours and was still tired when I woke up. I got up, showered, got dressed, had breakfast, and went to work. It was still dark when I arrived there. I was used to it. Winter mornings are always dark. There were lights on in the building, casting skewed yellow rays through the windows onto the parking lot. I used to find these lights cozy, but now they bothered me, because there weren't enough of them. Normally, all the lights in the common room and the dining hall would be glaring, but that day, only a few were on. I entered the code to come in. The hallways were dark. That was unusual. By this time, the night staff would have been busy waking up the early risers, and the ceiling lights would have been on. There was no one in the office. That fit. The night staff was small, and they all worked hard at the end of their shift. I strained my ears to hear their voices chatting at the ends of the hallways, but everything was quiet. Normally, I would have gone to the locker room to change into my uniform, then to the kitchen to grab an extra cup of tea, but that day, I just stood in the entrance hall at the office door and waited. It was so quiet. There should have been radios playing and faucets running. At least 1 or 2 residents already sitting in the common room watching TV. Along the main hallway, a door opened. I heard the squeak very clearly, saw the light from the room shining out, cutting through the carpet. It was a shadow in the light. A hunched and dark figure growing larger and making the light smaller as it filled the entire room. I saw Harold leaving his room that should have been locked. He stood in that tight spot of light forever, his breath audible from where I stood. Everyone will have their own memory of how it all began. For me, it started in a stuffy room where I watched an old man's chest rise and fall more and more slowly until it finally stopped altogether. I'd like to say it ended the same way, but I don't think it is ended, or won't end in the near future. There was something in Harold's hand, you see, something wet and dripping and organic. And as he started to run, I reacted instinctively. The wheelchair bay was right next to me. The wheelchairs were old because the company rarely spent their money keeping their equipment up to date, but I was grateful back then because the loose footplate I picked up fit perfectly in my hand. A long piece of bent metal with a footrest at the end, it was a perfect weapon, and I killed that old man a second time without the slightest hint of guilt. Don't judge me, he was already dead. I had already seen him die once. And if you had seen what he was holding in his hand as he ran toward me at a speed he shouldn't have been able to reach, you would have done the same. Helen came in shortly after. I was sitting on the floor, Harold's body not far away. She just examined a bit further before running to the phone and calling the police. She still hasn't told me what she saw, but I know the night staff won't be coming to work anytime soon. Yesterday, during my sick leave, Rita called me to her office for a meeting. I wanted Helen to be there, but instead, 2 men in suits with grim faces were there, not speaking to me at all. I was made to sign some papers that basically promised I wouldn't talk about the incident with anyone else. I signed them, but I don't care. I just wanted to go home. Their papers mean nothing to me. Before I got into my car to leave, I looked up and saw Tom standing at the window of my unit. his face pressed against the glass in a way I found strange and unsettling. Tom had always bothered me, but this was different. I'm not sure if I'll go back to work again. I don't want to be near him, or with Anna, or Rose, who stood by the bird bath at the edge of the unit, holding something while staring at me. I thought I saw feathers sticking out of her fingers. I think I'll just go back to bed. I'm feeling so sick.